stood looking at another man's wife. Then there were nine little Indians, their hearts so full of hate. One took his neighbor's goods, then there were eight little Indians, they just got down from heaven. One told a lie about another's best friend, then there were seven little Indians all trying to get their kicks. One thought he found another way to get to heaven, then there were six little Indians trying to stay alive. One took another's life, then there were five. Five little Indians all trying to find the door. One pulled his mother down, then there were four little Indians all thinking that they gotta be free. One little Indian forgot to say his prayers, then there were three little Indians deciding what they're gonna have to do. One took the name of God in vain, then there were two little Indians thinking that they ought to have some fun. One took a liking to a picture of himself, then there was one little Indian out looking for the sun. At 6 o'clock the moon came out, then there was none.
The EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. How's your day been?
Yeah, pretty good actually. Yeah, just another day, But I find the heat a bit hard to deal with. It's not my sort of thing. But it's been a little bit cooler today. So I've got a cat who's back and forth to the vet a lot at the moment because he obviously injured himself somehow, and he's he seems to be on the mend now. He's on industrial grade antibiotics. So yeah, that's some good news there.
Is it a youngish cat, oldish cat?
No, he's only about 6. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery what he did to himself.
Yeah, I had cats growing up. My parents had cats, and I was okay with them. But I've now become. Well, I think I was always a bit allergic to them, really, but now I don't have the tolerance anymore. So my adult life is basically trying to avoid furred pets as much as possible, which is a shame because I like cats.
Yeah, that is sad. Yeah, I'm glad I haven't developed an allergy because that would be very inconvenient.
Yeah, no, I think I always had it a bit when they slept on my bed and things like that. That I always, because I was like a childhood asthmatic, so I always had a bit of hypersensitivity to that sort of thing. But it's actually really started costing me quite a lot as I've got older because a lot of my old uni friends and stuff, when I want to go back to Scotland and visit them, they all have fucking pets now, so I just have to, I have to spend more on hotels than I really should be doing and things like that, Yeah, it's a drain.
Yeah, because otherwise it'd spend the entire visit with your nose running and red eyes, and yeah.
Yeah, I had one European holiday back in 2016 where I stayed at 2 friends' houses in succession, and they both had pets, and it nearly killed me. So I was just like, I'm not going to do this anymore. in the name of on the cheap, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah, fair enough.
The heat wave is making it, borderline unlivable. I remember, I know it was hot all over last year, but I remember last summer, we had those sort of 40-degree days and stuff. I remember walking out into the street and and I like the heat. I'm a bit of a lizard in that sense, but I remember genuinely feeling kind of a bit blowtorched from above. It really wasn't
Yeah.
promising for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, that was actually scary. Those couple of days, they were really frightening. It was like expecting trees to burst into flames or something.
Yeah, I rewatched. I was going to say I don't know why I did this, but of course I know I did this. That last summer I rewatched that Twilight Zone episode where they're going into the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Earth is spiraling into the sun.
Yeah,
and that's a pretty disturbing. I think it holds up really well actually. That episode, it's a really disturbing piece of 60s TV. But
yeah,
it was weird watching it last summer.
the ones that hold up are really good.
Yeah, there's some very interestingly directed bits of kind of hastily made budget TV there, aren't there? Like some really arty half hours. You know what? So I'll do the Welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast bit.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 58. That should cover it.
Yep.
So I was at the risk of sounding monomaniacal and predictable. I was talking about Star Trek earlier to you in messaging.
Yes.
Tends to come up a bit. I was actually talking to you about that, particularly in context of tonight's podcast episode, because I listen to a regular Star Trek podcast called All Our Yesterdays, which is a Patreon-only podcast that a couple of film critics do, where they're working their way through all Star Trek in the order it was released. So they've done the original series and the animated series, and they're sort of nearly halfway through TNG now. Mm-hmm. And they just covered the 4th season TNG episode Clues, which is one that I really fondly remember.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember the one I'm talking about?
Yes, I'm very fond of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yes, one of my favourites.
Yeah, I always really liked it, and I kind of, as a kid I took to it, and I really like Star Trek in general, but I suppose TNG, particularly when it's being kind of eerie. I think it's quite good at being eerie.
Yeah. One of my all-time favourite TNGs, which I learned fairly recently, I learned that it's not well regarded, which really puzzles me, is Night Terrors, which I find that genuinely spooky. There are bits in that are genuine. I remember watching it for the first time and being seriously creeped out. That's a great episode. I'm puzzled as to why it isn't more popular.
I think that one's coming up on that podcast soon, actually. I think it's quite near Clues in terms of, where season 4 is. I remember Night Terrors less well, but I remember some of the imagery in it, which gets quite crazy, doesn't it? Quite surreal. And the thing I like about Clues is, it's funny, I've come to this more in adulthood, really, is, I don't know if I always thought this at the time, but I've in adult life, rewatching TNG, I think Data is a pretty scary character. And I think it's, obviously it has his moments where they emphasize that more than others and stuff. But, Clues is like one of the all-time greats for that, because he's obviously quite early on they figure out that he's lying to them. And it's such an interesting vibe for that character, isn't it? And that performance, because I think the Brent Spiner performance as Data is wonderful. But in that, it's given it's like at peak eerie, isn't it?
Yeah, well, they kind of realise in real time, and you, the audience, realise with them, that they're basically at his mercy. They are just on a normal day-to-day level, they are dependent upon Data's goodwill. Data is so intellectually and physically and technologically superior to all of them that if he decided one day to be evil, if he decided to actually throw his lot in with law or something like that, they're screwed, basically. So they're completely reliant on his goodwill. So in that episode, when they realise that he's lying and stonewalling them, it's genuinely pretty spooky, because you think they're completely at his mercy. He can do what he wants. It's like they're sneaking around behind his back to try to figure out what's going on, and it's genuinely, they become like people in a police state who are trying to evade the watchful eyes of Big Brother, because Data's just, he can see everything they're doing, and they're desperate to escape that complete gaze and that complete brain.
Yeah, it's quite scary, that, isn't it? Data sort of as I suppose a manifestation of the ship in some other ways as well, and kind of he's almost like the human face or humanoid face of the ship, and and its power of calculation, its speed of calculation. I think there was some short story I had, a Star Trek short story compilation or something, the charity collection or something, when I was a teenager, and I'm pretty sure I might be half remembering this, but I think there was one where the gimmick is the Enterprise runs into something that's like a temporal anomaly or something, or a space anomaly or something, but basically an entire crisis erupts, but because it's this like mass, this kind of crazy physics crisis that's very specific, basically the entire crisis happens over about a 50th of a second. So the only person who even knows it's happened is Data, and he's already dealt with it. The story is him dealing with it, but at a speed that no one else can even perceive. So basically, then he just reports it, and Picard's like, "What? What happened?"
That sounds good.
Yeah, it was quite clever. Must find out what that was, but I was one of the reasons I was bringing up Star Trek to you before is like I think one thing I like perceiving, I guess, or noticing in Star Trek now when I rewatch it as an adult is how many different genres it plays with, from week to week, and which genres are sort of part of its DNA, or like kind of come up more frequently, or just innately part of what it's about. And I think detective fiction, mystery fiction, like puzzle solving fiction, essentially is kind of, I suppose you could say this about rather a lot of episodic television, but that's really so baked into it, isn't it? Like the kind of you show up at a planet or an island, and there's a situation, and your mission literally is to get to the bottom of it. That's kind of baked into Star Trek, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You have the series 1 episode Symbiosis that I wrote an essay about for one of the Outside In books, and that's very much a detective story in one way of looking at it anyway, because they have to figure out what's going on in this situation with these people from these two sets of planets and this very peculiar relationship that they have to each other. It seems to be a trading relationship, but one side is intensely desperate for the materials that they're trying to get hold of, etc. And they very much figure that out. Picard figures it out like a detective. There's another one, I think it's called the Masterpiece Society, which is kind of a snake in the Garden of Eden sort of story. It's a utopia, and it's Councillor Troy is the detective in that one. She has to work out what's going on. There's loads of episodes like that where there's some sort of secret that's animating the people that they're encountering that week, and the crew, either all of them or one of them has to be a detective to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. It's one of my other favourites. I suspect it might be one of yours too, but I don't know. Is just because of what we've talked about already, is the episode "The Survivors." Yeah. Which, if people don't remember which one that is, and those people may exist, but probably not amongst my listenership, is the episode where they turn up at that planet and there's that couple who seem to be alone, have survived a massacre, and they have to get to the bottom of that one. And that's another. I mean, that's a very Twilight Zone-y one, isn't it? But that's very eerie as well.
Yeah. That lives in the nightmares, that one, and it's the tinkly little tune that Councillor Troy picks up, telepathically, and it just keeps going round and round and round in her head, and it gets louder and louder, and she can't hear anything else, and she can't stop it, and she can't go to sleep. It's just this tune going round. It's proper nightmarish.
Well, actually, Clues has that uses Troy well in that sense as well. Do you remember there's that bit where because of what's going on in Clues, there's that bit where she goes to her quarters and screams, and someone comes in to investigate it, and she's like, "Well, I was looking at my face, but it wasn't my face," and it's really like Lovecraftian,
Yeah, that's another example of TNG in eerie mode. It was surprisingly good at that. It could do things that really made you uneasy. I've remembered that there is actually one. I think it's quite late. I think it's season 7 or something like that. I can't remember what it's called, but it is actually kind of a murder mystery. There's a crew member who sort of commits suicide by jumping into some sort of energy beam or something, and Councillor Troy starts picking up flashes from something that happened in that room on the ship years ago, and and she sees visions of things happening in the past, and she has to figure out. And at one point, I don't think it actually is there, but it seems like there's a dead body buried behind one of the bulkheads on the ship. That's a good one as well.
That's like a Star Trek TNG Argento movie or something.
Yeah.
Which is a subgenre that I've just made up and would like to exist.
Yeah.
No, I mean, one of my... Sorry, I will get us off TNG in a second, but that's one of my, again, quite late on episodes that I remember cherishing as a kid was the season 6 episode Schisms.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, with the, ultimately quite unconvincing sort of fish alien things that you sort of see a little bit too much of at the end. But it's that, you'll know what scene I'm going to talk about. It's the one where they have to recreate, on the holodeck, they have to recreate the sort of chair thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's TNG in spooky mode, particularly with the sort of the ambient clicking noise that they all remember in the background. It's good stuff. It's good
Yeah, and
stuff.
it's like speed it up, more clicks, speed it, make it faster and faster.
Yeah,
And then it's like it just it's and they've got that arm like curved like claw arm on the chair that they kind of
that's right.
it's
Yeah,
well that's sort of detective fiction as well, isn't it? Because they're sort of doing a holographic identikit of the room they
yeah,
were in.
yeah, absolutely.
So that's borrowing from detective fiction and kind of using the holodeck in a pretty creative way. I think
Mm-hmm.
it certainly made an impact on me as a kid.
Yeah, and there's an episode where Riker is he's in a play about a guy who's been incarcerated in a lunatic asylum, and he starts slipping into that reality. Like he keeps on, he's rehearsing the scene, and then suddenly he's actually in that reality, and people are telling him, "No, you're not really a Starfleet officer. You're a lunatic in a lunatic asylum." That's a pretty disturbing one.
That's pure Twilight Zone as well, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I remember my dad really liked that one for some reason. We're the ones that stand out as ones your parent liked. Like my dad was a TOS guy originally, but we all as a family kind of took to TNG, so we used to watch that together. That was up there with The Simpsons in terms of Fagiani family viewing collectively in the early 90s. We watched all that stuff. I remember, I think I've had this conversation with a few things, but I think I definitely mentioned it to our mutual friend Kit Power once, that I'd love to do a sort of project where you took every episode of TNG and you rewrite the synopsis, or specifically rewrite the endings, so that then they don't have to be episodic TV, basically. So that, I mean, not episodic, or rather, I suppose more episodic in a sense, because you do it so that you didn't have to do the show next week, basically. Take every single episode premise and you don't have to do Star Trek next week, so anything can happen. You don't have to reset the status quo. So you could take something like Frame of Mind, for example, but Riker actually does disappear into madness, or or ambiguity is left about that. You could do countless episodes where the ship's destroyed in various creative ways. But I suppose the challenge would be doing it, but just not in a sort of puerile, grimdark way for the sake of it. Although that could be fun quite a few times.
Yeah, sure, yeah. That would be quite Twilight Zone, because you could just do whatever you wanted with the characters.
Yeah, and I think you could take it in some pretty positive or utopian or kind of more beautiful moments as well. You could do things like what's that late episode of TNG, Emergence, is it? Where the ship sort of gains sentience / gives birth, or a mixture of those two things.
That's another one of my all-time favorites. I adore that episode. I love it when TNG gets a bit surreal. I love Emergence. I love Masks, which is another late one, where the ship kind of gets invaded by an alien computer program, and it starts sort of rewriting the structure of the ship, and everything starts turning into, it starts to look like an Aztec temple or something like that. And Data gets taken over by these different personalities from this ancient civilization that are sort of archived in the invading computer virus. That's a great episode. I love it when TNG gets a bit weird and out of left field. Yeah.
It's funny because I suppose it's not funny. It's predictable, I suppose. When I was watching most of TNG and very early DS9, like sort of the first two seasons of DS9, I was a kid, So a lot of the ones I liked and latched onto in that phase of being, kid Star Trek fandom essentially, are kind of the silly ones, the quote unquote silly ones, and they tend to be the ones that are quite derided. Like there's an early episode of DS9 that tends to like top all the worst episode polls, as I've called Move Along Home. Where
they get caught in a sort of board game, don't they?
Yeah, they basically get caught in Jumanji / the Crystal Maze, basically, and they have that bit that people particularly make fun of, where they have to like go singing like a children's rhyme to get through like a force field kind of thing. And I just loved that one, and I didn't realize it was meant to. I didn't realize it wasn't liked until many years later, and I was like, because I have such fond memories of it, and I suppose that was me starting to get introduced to sort of quote unquote serious fandom, or overcritical fandom, I suppose.
Fans can be so hypersensitive to anything. I think it's because fans are always worried about being mocked. For being fans and for being enthusiasts about stuff that isn't, particularly with stuff like Star Trek or Doctor Who or whatever, because it's not cool, or at least it wasn't when I was a kid. And Yeah, it is different now because like geek culture dominates the mainstream now. Superheroes and science fiction. It totally is the mainstream. But certainly back when I was a kid, there was a real. I'm sure it's still there, but I think it was more pronounced back then. There was a real division between culture that was, well, I mean, cool is probably the best word, cool and uncool. And if you're in a fandom like that, a fandom, I mean, it's not like that. If you're a football fan, that's acceptable. But if you're a Doctor Who fan or a Star Trek fan, then you're ostracized or ridiculed, or you might be to a certain extent. So fans develop this hypersensitivity to that sort of thing, and so they often develop a leeriness about aspects of the show that they're into that are silly, that are childish, that things that, if somebody else saw this, if one of my mates saw this episode, they'd laugh at me because they would think that I like this, whereas it's actually really silly or pantomimish or stuff like that. So they get oversensitive. But it's often the way, like that episode of DS9 you're talking about, that's actually a really interesting imaginative episode because it's like, again, it's metaphysical. They're actually in the game. So you're traversing layers of reality, and this whole sort of disjunct between the seriousness with which, and these people, they've got an entire culture that's based upon this game, and they treat it with such
been trying to cheat them as well. I seem to remember.
Yeah, of course, and they treat it with such seriousness that Quark actually thinks that when people die in the game, they die in real life, and you get that glimpse of Quark's moral center that he has actually got because he can't bring himself to do something that he thinks is going to kill the people in the game.
Yeah, he literally begs with them not to make him play, doesn't he? I remember that scene being really disturbing because it's like, you see that Quark has a line, but like B, you're also like, he's really pleading, he's really terrified,
Yeah. That's I've very strong memories of that one. So I think sometimes fans cheat themselves with that hypersensitivity to anything that's a bit silly.
Well, I think maybe that was particularly strong in DS9 fans because, and I know I say that as a big DS9 fan and as someone who grew up into it and watched the late series as well, and like loads of it, love loads of it really, but like, we obviously, and I was kind of part of this problem, I guess, or if it's a problem, I was part of this fandom. We wanted to be the serious Trek fans, right? We wanted to be the ones who weren't mocked, So I think that's why episodes like Move Along Home got under the skin a bit. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, DS9 did have a I don't want to say pomposity because I think its claims for itself were actually fairly reasonable. I think it did have it had some really great stuff, storylines about the Cardassian occupation and Bajoran politics and the ethics of terrorism and stuff that was like metaphors for truth and reconciliation after war crimes and things. It had some really intelligent episodes. So I don't want to call it pretentious or pompous because I don't think it was. I think it had stuff to back up this picture it had of itself as being quite serious minded. It was a really good show, particularly in those first 2 or 3 early seasons. But the thing about that was that it created a kind of a feeling of disjunction when you would get the funny episodes, Julian is playing Bond on the holodeck episodes and things like that.
Yeah, which I also enjoy. I think it's funny, isn't it? Because DS9's pomposity, if it has it, or the fandom pomposity, it's a pomposity constructed out of deconstructing the pomposity of other Star Trek, which is a weird thing. That's why it's up itself, is because it's basically taking Star Trek down a peg or two in some respects.
Yeah. What if we actually, instead of just we stay on this planet for half an hour 1 week and then we zoom away? What if we actually stay at this planet the entire time and we really go into the politics?
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. A little sidebar. Because I watched a few westerns as a kid and everything, but I wouldn't say I was steeped in westerns, particularly growing up. I watched the Leone films when I was a teenager and things like that. But when I went to university and got into Deadwood. I really got into Deadwood, as people tend to, really, but I realised after quite a while that partly why I enjoyed Deadwood so much was that it was a bit like DS9. Like I remember thinking, the sort of what do you call it, Swearingen and Bullock stuff is kind of Quark and Odo done for a different audience, Like, I know the influence isn't that way around, I know it's the other way around, but like I was just, that I realised that something in me was attracted to that frontier town setting for a TV show, and then I worked out where it was coming from, and it was DS9 basically.
Yeah, absolutely. DS9's a similar sort of story about a place right at the edge of the known world, and there's this collection of people who have these very uneasy relationships with each other, and some of them are quite morally questionable, etc. But of course, in DS9, it's toned down a lot.
Yeah, a little bit. I never really thought of it like this actually, because I spotted the Western influences on DS9 ages ago, but I hadn't really thought that the wormhole emerging at the beginning of the series is a bit like gold being discovered or something, isn't it? It's like it's kind of like a quasi-commercial thing that changes the whole appeal of the neighborhood, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. Because just like with the discovery of gold, loads of people suddenly rush into town. Suddenly, DS9 goes from being this backwater to being like the most important outpost in the entire quadrant.
Actually, I've just thought the other Deadwood parallels, quite a lot of DS9, at least in the background, is about whether Bajor is going to effectively be annexed or not. Whether it's going to become a state, essentially.
Yeah, colonized.
Yeah, well, yeah, quite.
So in a way, it really actually delivers for the first time on the whole Gene Roddenberry idea of Star Trek as wagon train to the stars, except that it does it in a bit of a more thoughtful way. It's not sort of Gene Roddenberry's 60s version of that. It's very utopian. It's very, the pioneers and the settlers going out there and exploring the wilderness. Whereas in DS9, it's very much about, the whole question of where Bajor is going to end up standing in relation to the Federation. It's very much like a territory out there in the West that's ambivalent about whether it wants statehood, whether it wants to become part of the Union, and the Federation becomes a bit like Washington, over on the other side of the continent. And it allows some complexity in that relationship. It allows some complexity in whether or not the Federation is really something you want to be. Because, of course, later on it brings in the Dominion, and as many people have noticed, the Dominion is kind of a reflection of the Federation in many respects.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned the Dominion actually, because I will get off DS9 now, but just finally, did you see that documentary they made about DS9 a few years ago?
No, I didn't.
It was, so basically they did loads of traditional documentary stuff, interviewed all the cast, and did all that and celebrated it and talked to loads of fans and all that sort of stuff. But they interviewed all the showrunners, and they basically got them back together, the showrunners and several of the writers, including Ronald D. Moore and people like that. They got them back in a room, and they had them at least outline. I think they wrote a pilot episode, and they at least outlined what a sort of theoretical sequel series to DS9 would be like a sort of season 8 or a few years on kind of thing, or a bit like the Deadwood TV movie actually. Like if you were to do that, for DS9, what would it be like? And they had a mixed bag of ideas, and some of it sounded really cheesy, and some of it sounded ill-advised, and all that sort of stuff. But they came up with, and this is in the documentary, they came up with what I thought was an absolutely brilliant but very dark idea. Was that post-Dominion War, Bajor still in this sort of, halfway house of not having quite joined the Federation, this kind of thing, because they're so paranoid about, being dominated by other powers and the Cardassians and the Federation, all that sort of stuff. What they do is they end up basically taking on the Jem'Hadar, because the Jem'Hadar are sort of rootless and looking for new masters, essentially new gods. Mm-hmm. And the Bajorans, because they understand the power of religion, but also because they're this isolated, paranoid planet, they realise that what they need is an army. So they basically end up taking on the Jem'Hadar as like their new foot soldiers, and suddenly Bajor is like the most militarily terrifying power in the quadrant. And I was like, that's brilliant.
I like that, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Completely instantaneously reverses the relationship between Bajor and Cardassia, because after the Dominion War, Cardassia's in ruins, and suddenly Bajor is the aggressive, conquering power that's eyeing up Cardassia. Yeah, that'd be really interesting. I remember, I found the end of DS9 very disappointing, but part of that was that I was convinced I'd worked out what was going to happen. I had this idea in my head. I was convinced that it was going to turn out that the Cardassian occupation of Bajor had been engineered by the Par Wraiths to create a situation where there were loads and loads of dead bodies on Bajor, and I thought the Par Wraiths are going to they're going to occupy the dead bodies. What's going to happen is that when they escape and they get to Bayshore, they're actually going to get into all these bodies that are lying around and animate them, and that's going to be their way back into our dimension. I was convinced that was what I had it all worked out. I had the not literally but metaphorically, I had the wall with the bits of red string, etc. I know that's what's happening. I've seen all the clues, and then of course that was just in my head. That didn't happen. I remember being very angry about that.
I've certainly been in fandom situations a bit like that, where my headcanon is so adhered to that I think it's going to happen, and then it doesn't. I'm like, grr. Yeah. I think it's funny actually. I was just the age I was about 14, I think, when DS9 wrapped up. Probably 15 when I saw the last episode, and I was just starting to get out of that. Not being a Star Trek fan in general, because that's never left me, but out of that flush of it. So. For instance, I watched the end of DS9, but it was already becoming a bit of a duty, and Voyager I'd completely checked out of already, and didn't go with Enterprise or anything like that. So I think it was just, and I was becoming the kind of teenager who was into different things, and in my mid to late teens I got into completely different things, and it's kind of where I left Star Trek for a bit. Is like right at the end of DS9, but I love DS9 so much I couldn't quite leave it before the end. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very much the same sort of thing for me, actually. I was a bit older than that, but yeah. They oversaturated us with too much Star Trek in the 90s, and it got a bit tiring. You did feel like, oh, right, okay, I've got to keep up with this now, and and something had to go, and Voyager was the easiest to ditch, because Voyager really... I think
really
there's
stupid.
some good stuff in Voyager, but yeah, it very much loses its way after a little while.
Yeah, there's not much to be said for most of late Voyager. There are a few gems.
Yeah.
You know what? Actually, it's not veering too far off the path, but veering kind of closer to the theoretical topic of tonight's episode. I wanted to stay on the sort of sci-fi horror thing a little bit, because I thought it was interesting to touch on, because it was something else I was messaging you the other day when we were talking about this. So we're obviously going to talk a bit more later on about Agatha Christie and about one specific Agatha Christie work. But in reading that work for this episode, at your suggestion, I was, it's a book I've never read before. I was put in mind of there's a plot point in the book where it put me in mind of Alien 3. It's it's something to do. Well, we'll talk about what it's to do with later on when we talk about the book. But see how nimbly I dodged there. I almost started talking about the topic and then just veered away by millimeters.
Yeah. It's good, really professional stuff.
That was a low swoop over the terrain. But I got thinking about the Alien series, a series of which I know you're extremely fond and interested in. And I've been kind of looking forward to it. I'm really not going to let this take up the whole episode, although for me at least it very easily could do. And I know I could probably set you loose on it, and I'd have to get the fire extinguisher.
Yeah, I was going to say, be careful.
Well, it's just zeroing in on it then. So I was thinking, maybe if you just take the first 3 Alien films, for example, I was thinking about them as elements of sort of detective / mystery fiction. Because obviously, it's well-worn territory, isn't it? That all those first 3 Alien films are doing quite different things, and they're at least a few of them arguably exist in completely different genres or are trying to do different sort of genre things. But I was thinking about, because I started thinking about Alien 3. Maybe it helps to work backwards, almost like take Alien 3 first and then work backwards through the trilogy. But I was thinking how, I was joking to you like that you could call Alien 3 Murder at the Lead Mold. But I was thinking about the sort of murder mystery, or like Marplishness of it, in a sense, of this this female character, this outsider turning up again at this planet, this problem to be solved planet, and this cast of suspects basically. And I was thinking, if you did Alien 3 as a standalone movie where you, the audience, didn't know what the threat was, which I think is quite an interesting concept anyway. If you watch Alien 3 as a standalone movie and you just see this character, Ripley, crash, and you learn all the stuff alongside her, and then these murders start happening, and at first you, the audience, don't see what's happening. It really could be that kind of thing, couldn't it? It could be a sort of Christie in space, almost,
Sure, yeah. I think I've actually talked about this a little bit when I talked with George Daniel Lee about Alien 3, because we did a show about Alien 3. And I think I said to him that Alien 3 could be a standalone movie. Like, if you showed it to somebody that had never heard of the Alien franchise, never seen any of the other films, it would work. Certainly in the longer version, the longer cut, you could very easily watch that film and interpret the early stuff with the dead bodies of Newt and Hicks and so on the escape pod as just backstory, and then you have this character and she's a mystery, and then as you're watching the film, you're seeing the monster evolve, but you're as a story in its own right, you, the audience, completely new to this, you're watching it and you're thinking, what the hell is that? What's going on? And Ripley just won't tell anybody, and you think, well, she knows, but she's not saying anything. Why not? You could just take the film pretty much as it is, as a standalone piece. And with you're absolutely right. With some very minor editing, maybe probably just cutting out some of the more explicit shots of the monster, you could frame it as a whodunit. She arrives on the planet and people start dying, and you could even make it that she's one of the suspects. Is this mysterious woman sneaking out of the hospital and committing these murders?
Yeah, she does that in a fairly suspicious way if you take it on that way. Yeah. And also, obviously, if you keep most of the plot and setting the same and details, so obviously she's in a place full of very, very dangerous men, right? So it's kind of, you've kind of got quite a lot of suspects, and they're all British, so it basically is an Agatha Christie.
That's right. Yeah, it's a classic British parlor room mystery that just set on a convict planet.
Yeah. Well, knowing less than you about Agatha Christie, it's sort of Ripley's, what's it called, Curtain, the Poirot, the final Poirot.
Yeah. There are instances of sci-fi whodunit crossovers, aren't there? There's an episode of Blake Seven. I don't know if you know that series at all, but in series 1, I think, there is an episode where it's basically a whodunit on a space station or a spaceship or something. The regular crew, Blake and etc., they encounter a ship that's drifting in space, and there's been murders. And Avon, the Paul Darrow character, he actually sort of becomes the detective and figures it out. It's got a proper whodunit format, and it's like a lot of Blake Seven. It's the results are mixed, but it's kind of cute in and of itself.
Tell me, because I've obviously, being British and being a sci-fi nerd, I've read quite a bit about Blake Seven, and obviously by reputation and fans of a certain age and everything. Obviously, it's got this cult, and you see those clips of it occasionally on TV of like certain iconic scenes in it, and like certain camp elements of it, things like that. This is genuine ignorance on my part. Is Blake Seven the kind of show where you can sort of recommend individual good or interesting episodes, or is it not really that sort of show? I just don't know enough about it.
It is. It is a running storyline. You have running villains, and you have running storylines that go from episode to episode. So there's an extent to which you are following a continuous story, but it is also very much a sort of monster of the week show, or scenario of the week, or planet of the week, whatever you like. I mean, It's not unlike the X-Files, where you have the mythos episodes and you have the Monster of the Week episodes, and you can take, even sometimes the edges are a bit blurred, but you can take an episode that's a Monster of the Week episode, and even if it's got some aspects of the overarching mythology in it, you could still watch it on its own terms. And I think that's very true of Blake Seven, and it does have some very good standalone stuff. It's funny, we were talking about Voyager before. Voyager, for all its faults, it has 2 of my absolute favourite bits of Star Trek, just as isolated one-off episodes. One of them is called Distant Origin, which is a really great episode about it's kind of about evolution and creationism, and the conflict between that whole religious versus scientific view of origins, except that it's relocated to an alien planet with these reptile people on it. And one of them is a scientist, and he develops, I think I'm remembering this right, he develops the idea that they're actually descendants of people that came to that planet and from another planet, and they weren't, I don't remember exactly, but it's a great episode in its own terms. And there's another one, I don't remember what it's called, but one of the Q continuum turns up, and he wants to die. And the episode is about the ethics of suicide, the ethics of assisted suicide and stuff like that. Yeah. It's got some great standalone stuff, and I think the same is true of Blake Seven.
Yeah, the episode in question, Distant Origin, it has the bit, we talked about schisms before, it has arguably much sillier bit where I think it's Jane Wayne Chakotay recreate like a Hadrosaurus on the holodeck because they're trying to work out what these people descended from, which strikes me right now and talk about that that episode is not, maybe it's just how 90s it all is, it's not that dissimilar to the Super Mario Brothers movie, but something was in the air. But Death Wish, the episode you're talking about, obviously has that cool surreal bit where they like go to the Q continuum as well.
Yeah.
Do you remember that bit where it's like this dusty desert town where nothing happens, you know?
Yeah, that's really good. I remember that as being really effective, and the performances are lovely in that as well.
I do enjoy John Delancey, I've got to admit. I think people's mileage varies with him a little bit.
Yeah, they really thrash the hell out of Q. You know, by the time you've got, I mean, at one point you have like an episode where his girlfriend's there and they're having a baby or something like that, and it's like, oh, you know, please, enough already. But no, that's a good one.
Yeah, he's like you know, because Star Trek is, you know, obviously a multi-authored thing, and it varies, you know, week to week or season to season depending on who's in charge and what the opinions of the characters are. Q strikes me as one of the most comic booky types, not only in that he's a kind of comic book character in terms of his powers and things like that, but also he really, what he means and what his character does to the show and the ways in which they use his character on the show really does vary so much writer to writer that it could be a different character every time almost, you know, like the Q in you know, the Robin Hood episode, for example, like there's so little resemblance to the Q who introduces them to the Borg that they may as well be two different god beings, really, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. But the version of Q that you get in Death Wish, you remembered the title, is you know, he's Q as I find him interesting. He's actually concerned about, you know, he's actually acting on the ideology of being a Q. You know, he's acting on conviction to a certain extent. It's a kind of conservatism. It's a kind of conservatism that is really interesting for him, because in other respects he's been a rebel from the continuum, but ultimately there is this core of you know, something reactionary to Q, where he's opposing this essentially a bid for self-determination on the part of one of the others. Really it seems from a very much you know, an ideological position. That's really interesting to me. It's much more interesting than kind of the comedy ones.
Because the idea of mortality sort of disgusts him almost on like a evolutionary level. You know? Which he's like a Q fundamentalist. You know, like you should not try and be more like humans in a sense. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. In the sense that he's a rebel in the continuum. He's a rebel from an almost an extreme reactionary position. You know.
Yes, is this where we're walking to talk about Q as a version of Ledger's Joker?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is what I say about the Joker. He's by far my favorite thing in all of those movies, because what's clever about him is that he's you know, he thinks he's a anarchist, whereas what he actually is a reactionary conservative, and that's a species that we actually have in the real world. They're called anarcho-capitalists. Yeah,
it's one of the reasons for which he's chilling, really, isn't he? Is that kind of that tension, I suppose. That and the amazing performance. Well, you know, just quickly then, sort of neatly stepping over Aliens, because I believe you prefer to do that.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the second film, I'm afraid.
I think I may have heard you mention that before. I believe the first Alien film has interesting elements of sort of mystery to it as well, doesn't it? And I was thinking that, you know, in terms of our main topic, which we'll get onto shortly, you've got people being offed one by one. You know, you haven't got a detective figure whatsoever, but you have got, in the person of Ash, you have got someone who's a sort of a snake in the midst of the crowd, basically, haven't you? You've got a kind of, you know, an undercover agent, basically, and so it's got that kind of Christie-esque, you know. It sort of does both, really, doesn't it? Because you've got the ineffable alien threat, but in the person of Ash, you've also got the saboteur in the group. So I think Alien is this interesting employment of that sort of mystery fiction as well, amongst the other things Alien's doing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's strangely similar in form. You have this disparate group of people who are stranded together. You know, it's similar to the text we're going to be talking about. In that you have this disparate group of people who don't really, you know, they're capable of getting on, largely when it comes to sitting around and eating together, but they're not really very compatible people. They don't actually get on very well, or at least most of them don't, and they're kind of stranded together. I don't know why, but I have always been very attracted to and fascinated by stories about that, about groups of people who are basically strangers to each other, who are in a context or a place away from home, out of their home context, who are stuck together, and they have to muddle through or learn to deal with each other or get on or fail to do so. I've always been really fascinated by that kind of story where you have a selection of people stuck together, but it's very much like that. For an island, make it a spaceship, and again they start dying one by one. And yeah, you're right about Ash. There are clues. There are clues right the way through, and there's obviously something weird about him, and you're shown Ripley having suspicions about him and things like that. So yeah, it has some of the whodunit format, and there's even the subplot about the company actually being behind them being there, actually sending them out that way and giving secret orders to Mother and Ash. So yeah, there's an element of that in Alien, absolutely.
There's almost something. It's a bit of a stretch, maybe, but there's something almost like a bit Christie-esque as well about, in a certain way, if you look at it a certain way, about the chestburster scene, because you were talking about the meeting together and stuff, and it's obviously in detective fiction you get all sorts of different sorts of murders in different circumstances, and more often they are the kind of more slasher movie type, you wander off alone and you get done away with, whether inside of the audience or not. That's obviously more common and indeed more common in Alien. But in the chestburster scene, you do have the kind of, it's almost like the more like the equivalent of someone downing cyanide at the dinner party or something, isn't it? It's this happening in a domestic setting in the plain light of day in front of several witnesses, and the alien is so strange and monstrous that it may as well be unexplained in a way. It's like a shot rang out kind of thing,
Yeah. One of the things about And Then There Were None is that it's one of Christie's less gruesome books. It's one of her less bloody books. There is some blood in it. Well, I mean, particularly I think Rogers, who is killed with a hatchet. He's actually chopped up with an axe. That's pretty. It's not described in gruesome detail, but that's pretty bloody. But she was fond of murders where there's a lot of blood. There's one novel where an old guy gets killed at Christmas, and part of the plot is that there's just blood everywhere, But the trope of the person at a dinner party or at lunch who's just chatting away and takes a drink and suddenly starts choking and stands up and falls over because there's cyanide in their drink. She was very fond of that one, and that kind of happens in And Then There Were None as well. So yeah, the unexpected
choked himself, and then there were 9, right?
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, the unexpected death over the table. Yeah, absolutely.
We should try. I won't make you do this on air, or indeed collaborate with you doing this on air. But we should come up with a rhyme for Alien. That's like, there were 7 people on a ship, and and then this happened, and kind of make it all a bit veiled, but make it work in terms of the plot.
Yeah,
that'd be quite fun. Well, what you're getting into the trope. You named the work we're talking about, and we'll get into that and more in a second. But just finally, before we move on to the main text that you wanted to talk about, you were talking about the tropes of Christie there and sort of the styles of Christie. Just more for fun than anything else, and kind of as a later career return to some of your previous stomping grounds in terms of criticism. Can we talk very briefly about The Unicorn and the Wasp?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we chatted about that a little bit on the in the back channel, didn't we? The Doctor Who episode, written by Gareth Roberts, where the Doctor and Donna that he's with in that episode, they meet Agatha Christie, don't they?
That's right. Yeah, she's played by. I did actually note the actress's name because she's one of those actresses that she has that sort of unique face. You never mistake her for anyone else. Fenella Woolgar is the actress's name. And this is from the 2008 series, which is the 4th series of the revival. And you're right, it is Donna. And I rewatched this because I rewatched some Who during lockdown, sort of a bit scattershot, sort of scattered around. And this wasn't, I think, one of the ones that I got to. So I probably hadn't seen this one in about, not quite since it was on, but kind of near enough, like kind of a good decade or something like that. And it was quite weird because I hadn't rewatched a lot of that series in general for a while. And it was kind of being put right back in my sort of 2008 head, and all the things I both liked and was starting to become weary of about the sort of Russell T Davies era of Doctor Who, or what I guess we'll have to start getting used to calling the first Russell T Davies era of Doctor Who, which is still mind blowing that that's happening.
Absolutely.
But yeah, do you remember much about that? Do you remember much about that episode at all, and I suppose specifically about its portrayal of Christie and sort of Christie tropes?
Firstly, you've kind of you've kind of shocked me by telling me that it was 2008, which I suppose I knew, but it's still kind of shocking to think, my God, really? Is it really that long ago? Which, yes, it was. It was 2008.
It was the Bush
Blimey.
presidency still.
Yes, God, have I really been alive that long? I suppose I have. Yeah, the Bush presidency. We didn't know when we had it good, did we? Yeah, I was in a funny old place with Doctor Who at that point because I've always been very ambivalent about the revival series. I disliked series 1 quite a lot when it came on in 2000, whatever it was, 2005. I've since completely reevaluated the first series with Christopher Eccleston. I'm very fond of it now. There's some problems, but I think it's pretty damn good. I am very much less keen on Tennant and the Tennant years, but I think some of my favourite episodes from that era are from Series 4. I think Midnight is a great episode. I think Planet of the Ood is a great episode. Turn Left is an amazing episode. Unicorn and the Wasp, not one of my favourites, I have to say. I'm not an admirer of Gareth Roberts. And, it just strikes me as kind of, well, I should be careful because I haven't seen it since first broadcast. So maybe it's a gem, and if I watched it again, I'd eat my words.
I don't think it is. just to head you off at the pass there.
In my memory, I think of it as kind of emblematic of everything that I didn't like about that era. The whole idea of the celebrity historical. By the time you get to Agatha Christie, and it's become a kind of a game to put the names of as many of her books into the script as an in-joke as you possibly can. That strikes me as kind of pointless, and it's very media, isn't it? One of the problems that you had with the Russell T Davies era, and it got worse and worse and worse as it went on, was this media obsession. It was very in the sense of being very concerned with like the television business, to the point where you have like robots in one that look like BAFTA awards, and Agatha Christie, of course, these days, she's this massive television franchise. She's this massive television property. Certainly at the time, I think you still had the David Suchet Poirots going on. You had the 2000s version of Marple still going on. It's all over ITV. BBC's got the Christie stuff now, but back then it was still ITV, and they were churning out the Agatha Christie. It was all Agatha Christie, and even the stuff that wasn't Agatha Christie was kind of imitation Agatha Christie. Like Midsummer Murders and all these gigantic juggernauts, all based on this idea of what Agatha Christie is. In some ways, quite a misleading and mistaken idea of what it is. People who haven't read the books, and I'm not making a huge defensive case for Agatha Christie. Don't get me wrong. I'm not claiming she's a misunderstood genius, but people that haven't read the books, they kind of have this idea of Agatha Christie as, everything set in a little village and with a cast of cute eccentrics, etc., etc. And there's a murder around the village fete, and you just certainly at that point in time, you just had endless television that was just that, either Christie adaptations or that sort of Christie imitation or pseudo imitation. So it just strikes me as being really kind of up its own fundament, and very concerned with hooking Doctor Who into that hegemonic showbiz juggernaut. And I don't remember. I remember Christopher Benjamin is in it, and it's always nice to see him. But I don't have very fond memories of it otherwise.
Is Christopher Benjamin the guy who plays the vicar who turns into the giant wasp?
No, he's the old chap. He played Jago in Talons of Weng Chiang.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. I don't know the classic series as well as you do, but I know that one for various reasons. Was Gareth Roberts the guy who wrote the Shakespeare Code as well? Because I guess it's very much in that vein, isn't it?
Yes, he wrote the Shakespeare Code. Yeah.
Well, knowing what I know of your interests, and I think I've probably heard you talk about that once or twice in the past. But
it's possible.
I mean, it makes sense for us to be a pair, doesn't it? Because they're kind of doing very similar things, I guess. I'm probably pissing off hardcore Christie fans just as much as the Shakespeare Code pissed you off.
Possibly. I recall the Shakespeare Code as being much worse, to be honest. But yeah, it's a bit funny, the idea that we want an episode about a great writer. Firstly, we'll give that to Gareth Roberts. And secondly, well, one of them will be about Shakespeare, and one of them will be about Agatha Christie. It's like, yeah, I seem to remember the rationale in episode for why she's such an important figure being explicitly the Doctor saying this as well, that she's sold millions and millions of copies, which is a bit, I don't know, that doesn't sit very well with me either. You know, the Doctor is very admiring explicitly on the basis that she's shifted a hell of a lot of product. I don't know about that really.
Well, it feels quite spiritually up there with the J.K. Rowling stuff in Shakespeare Code as well, doesn't it? It is. Yeah. I mean, whatever else you could read into Gareth Roberts regarding that and everything. When obviously this is a lifetime ago now, but like there is that kind of worship of commercialism a little bit, isn't there? There's kind of it's just things, and actually, I don't know how much Russell T Davies meddled in those scripts and stuff, but probably quite a lot given his sort of track record and stuff. And I think there is, one of the. I wouldn't even judge it really, but just one of the sides of Russell T Davies's sort of unique style and everything is he kind of is fascinated with things being big, isn't he? And about things, how they get big, and sort of celebrating them for being big against the odds and things like that. And obviously it's weird. It's almost meta, isn't it? Because like the whole Doctor Who revival is that the whole it's something being massive against the odds.
Yeah, absolutely. And when he's interesting, which he's capable of being a very interesting writer. It's often about that as well. I was saying about how some of my favourite episodes from that era are from Series 4. I like the first episode in Series 4, which is called, I can't remember what it's called, Partners in Crime. And that's about kind of this new phenomenal weight loss product, isn't it? And about how this sort of product has come out of nowhere and it's completely taken over the market. And it's got some interesting stuff to say about that as well. So it's the same obsession can go one way or the other.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I watching the Unicorn and the Wasp. I think because we'll get more into the tropes as we discuss the novel in question. But I was just sort of struck. I suppose in reading up a little bit around Christie for this podcast, I was reading up about I wanted to date check when Cluedo was first published. Which I thought might be relevant, and it was 1943, I believe.
Yes,
which is 4 years after, and then There Were None came out. And I was thinking about the sort of codification of the murder mystery to the point, and particularly the Christie-esque murder mystery, I suppose, where to the point where something like Cluedo could exist. The point where people would get the joke of Cluedo, and it would be a commercially successful game. Because it's kind of it has just become. Well, literally include things to move around on a board, doesn't it? And these characters. We'll get into talking about the book shortly, but I actually, to help me talk about this book, because it was the first time I was reading it, I made a list of the characters and their surnames and what their occupation is and the order in which they die. And I realised I was basically plotting out a sort of Colonel Mustard, Reverend Green, Professor Plum type scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been 4 screen adaptations of this novel, because one of the things that people might not know is that this novel, and then There Were None, which is what we call it now, that's something we might talk about. This is actually Agatha Christie's most successful novel. This is her biggest seller. This was her biggest success. Her biggest novel is not a Poirot, it's not a Marple, it's not any of those. It's this one, which is a complete standalone with none of her running characters in it.
Well, can I say on that note, just briefly, Jack, when you asked me to talk about this, and because I knew it was successful, I knew it was famous and iconic for her, I was looking for versions of this I could watch quickly, but like kind of easily to hand versions. So I spent ages looking through the David Suchet Poirot index. This is before I'd read the book, and I was like, where they must have got, because I know famously Suchet got around to doing all of them. Like, where is it? Is it under a different title? Because obviously that could be the case. And I was like, where is it? I was getting really frustrated, and then I started reading the book. I was like, oh, it's not a Poirot. Okay. It's a complete shock to me. I just thought it's massive and it's a Christie. It must be a Poirot, basically.
Yeah, no, she wrote several of her best novels are standalones without any of her running characters in. There's one of her, Towards Zero, it's called, which has Inspector Battle in it, and he's one of her minor returning characters, one of the ones that most people haven't heard of, but he's not crucial in it. So a lot of her best books, Endless Night, Crooked House, Towards Zero, Ordeal by Innocence, are just these standalone books or semi-standalone books. There is one Poirot which is among her very best, Appointment with Death. That's a really interesting novel. But yeah, a lot of her best stuff is this standalone stuff. And it can be hard to tell, actually, because another thing, in adaptation, they always have the same shape. They start with Poirot's there and he's a guest or whatever. It's not like that in the novels a lot of the time. A lot of the time, Poirot doesn't show up until 2/3 of the way through the book. But certainly in Appointment with Death, the one I was just talking about, I think it's about halfway through the book, and the murder happens, and then he gets called in. So if you just leafed through the first 100 pages or whatever, you wouldn't know it was a Poirot novel.
Mm. It's funny, that strikes me as, going back to what we were talking about TNG, that idea of rewriting TNG episodes so that they could all be, consequence free in a sense, or the opposite, have consequences. You couldn't do, and then there were none if it was a Poirot, could you? Or if it had a character who was going to come back,
Yeah. No, it's absolutely dependent upon there being no survivors. You ruin the whole effect if you have anybody on the island who makes it off again. You do have characters that don't die, but they are only in the epilogue. They arrive for one chapter and just have a chat and then disappear again. Yeah. If you put any running characters on there, you have to kill them.
which we might get to. You say it would completely ruin the effect. We might get to that when we talk about some of the adaptations, I guess.
Yeah. We were talking about Cluedo, and what I was saying was that, as I say, this was one of her biggest books, and it was published in 1939. And I think that's really interesting as well, that it's published in the run-up to World War II. But and then Cluedo comes along in 1943, and I think there are 4 screen adaptations, as I was saying. There's the old black and white one from the 1940s. There's a 1970s one, which is 1945. It's just as the war's ending. There's the 1970s one, which is, I so want to like that, but it's really badly made. Particularly the music. The music is intolerable. That's a thing, actually. 1970s adaptations of Christie novels. There's an adaptation of Ordeal by Innocence, which is a great book, and they did an adaptation in the 1970s with Donald Sutherland. And it's like, wow, I want to see this. It's unwatchable because of the bloody incidental music. It just never stops, this fucking trad jazz soundtrack, and it's just, you can't bear it. Yeah, so there's the 1940s adaptation, there's the 1970s adaptation, there's a Soviet adaptation from the 1980s, and then there's the television adaptation from, I think it was 2017, 2018, something like that. But the most famous adaptation has got to be Cluedo. Because I think Cluedo is, in many respects anyway, it's an adaptation of this book. And then, of course, you get onto the fact that Cluedo, or Clue as it's known in America, was then turned into a film. So you have the film Clue, the comedy whodunit with Tim Curry, etc. That is, down the line, that is itself an adaptation of And Then There Were None as well.
Sure, yeah, and every time you play Cluedo, you're sort of reenacting, to an extent reenacting it. I suppose you've got the, is it kind of Mr., it's either like Dr. Black or Mr. Body, depending on which version of Cluedo you're playing, isn't it? The sort of, the host of the house who's gathered you all there and then is done away with, or is not there, is absent,
Yeah, well, in every set I've ever had, it's always Mr. Black who's the host, but we've always just referred to it as Mr. Body. Every time, playing at a university. Nobody said Mr. Black.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating actually reading this for the first time, because I'd never read this book before. I'd read some Christie. I'd read some of the like Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, and things like that. I'd read a couple of Marples, including Murder at the Vicarage. I think I mentioned to you I read the Murder of Roger Ackroyd at university, because I did a detective fiction module as part of my English literature degree.
And that's a very famous, much studied text, for interesting reasons.
For people who haven't read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I won't, it's up there with, one of Christie's greatest sort of concepts, basically, and kind of, the execution of it is really good as well. And it was in reading up for this one I realised that, or read that Ackroyd was already really popular and kind of notable. It kind of made her name in some respects, hadn't it? In the mid-20s.
Yeah.
So when this book was published, that was kind of the one to live up to, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. She was successful before Ackroyd, but Ackroyd is the one where she really makes a splash, with critics and the public, certainly. So when she's writing this, that's probably the one that most people would have known her for, and the one that she's, aiming to match, I suppose.
Yeah, and some of the more positive reviews of this at the time seem to have been, the sort of nearest to rave reviews of And Then There Were None seem to have been, oh, she's matched Ackroyd, or this is another Roger Ackroyd. And it's kind of, it's interesting, is it? Because again, say without going into Ackroyd, this is similarly high concept, isn't it? You've got that ambition and that kind of sellability.
Yeah, and part of how And Then There Were None works is similar to how The Murder of Roger Ackroyd works as well. Some of the literary techniques, shall we say, that she uses in Ackroyd are also employed to make And Then There Were None work as a text.
Yeah. Well, do you just do you just want to jump off the deep end then and start the bidding in a sense, and talk a little bit about why you wanted to talk about And Then There Were None, and why you find it such a fascinating text? Because I was really eager, when we were talking about what this EscapeGoat podcast could be about, and you kind of approached me with, I really want to talk about this book. I really want to, get this off my chest, and kind of, talk about why this is such an interesting book. And I really, I've got some ideas of my own where I think, we might chime with things we find interesting and appealing about it, but I'd really want to hear, I guess I want to give you the chance to monologue a little bit about why it's so fascinating.
Yeah, I'd love to. Could we have the break first?
I think that's a really good idea. Yeah. And actually a great cliffhanger as well.
7 little space truckers stopped by the sticks. One choked at dinner, and then there were 6. 6 little space truckers hunting to survive. One took a shower, and then there were 5. 5 little space truckers searching through the floors. One dug a tunnel, and then there were 4. 4 little space truckers looking to be free. One rolled up a magazine. You have my sympathies. 3 little space truckers now know what to do, rushing to get packed. And then there were 1 little space trucker, a kerfuffle, then splat. Then they nodded off, next to their cat.
Welcome back, and Jack, the floor is yours.
Okay. Like a lot of my obsessions, it's fundamentally pre-rational. I can't really fully explain why it fascinates me so much. I read this book, And Then There Were None, when I was very young. And firstly, I suppose the thing that I loved about it was, me being me, the thing that I loved about it was that it's so deliciously creepy. There are bits of it that are very creepy and unnerving indeed. There are suggestions of the supernatural. On its surface, it's a completely natural materialist story, which seems to have a rational explanation at the end. That's something I'd like to talk about, whether the explanation that we're given is really satisfactory at all. But that is how the book presents itself. It presents itself as a story about the real world without anything supernatural, although it recognizes its own supernatural affect, its own uncanny aspect, because it actually at one point talks about it refers to Blore, who's one of the characters. Maybe we should do a little bit of a plot recap actually for the book. I'll just finish what I'm saying, which is that it refers to one of the characters in the book Blore as being brave but unnerved by the situation that is actually unfolding in the book, because this is pretty much a quote from the prose, because it's tinged with the supernatural. So it acknowledges that there is something uncanny, supernatural feeling about what's going on. And I think, as I say, me being me, that's why reading it as a young kid, it appealed to me so much. I'd already read other Agatha Christie novels by then, but this was the one that really grabbed me, because it does have this very, very strange, weird, unnerving, creepy atmosphere to it. In some ways, in some moments of the book, it's like a ghost story. Let's do that recap, actually. We need the context. What happens in the book is, in case people don't know this, about one of the most famous, the most successful novel written by probably the best-selling author in all of history.
Yeah, and we will be spoiling this, by the way. We will be spoiling this book.
Yes, we will be spoiling the shit out of this. So if you haven't, if you don't know the story, then pause the podcast, go and read it, or watch one of the adaptations, and then come back. So you have been warned. What happens is that a group of people, 8 people, complete strangers to each other, disparate people. In fact, they fit they're really archetypes. You can describe them as archetypal figures. You have a judge, a doctor, a policeman, a teacher, a spinster, a soldier, a criminal, and a wastrel. Those are the types.
Some of those, I said I was going to make a note of all the characters. Some of those are the exact words I used to jot them down.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like wastrel. That's good.
Wastrel, yeah. They are invited by somebody who rather cunningly sends each of them a crafted invitation that makes them think that they've been contacted by somebody they know, or that they're going to meet somebody who knows somebody they know, whatever. And in every case, the letter comes from some variation on the name U.N. Owen, which already we've encountered something about the book, which is that it is incredibly. It has this weird thing all the way through, where it is a combination of being genuinely sinister and incredibly naff. And I think the fact that the unknown killer that lures them all to this island, which is where they're invited to, calls themselves UN Owen, or Unknown, and then halfway through the book, one of them realizes, actually, look at these signatures, UN Owen. That's a bit like Unknown. It's hilariously naff.
It's funny because I recently rewatched Batman Forever, and it was reminding me of the Edward Nigma, Mr. Enigma thing.
Yeah,
I could hear Val Kilmer explaining it in my head.
Yeah, but that at least has the defense of being deliberately silly. That is deliberately a comic book movie. It has some self-awareness. I don't think Agatha Christie was aware that she was doing something naff when she invented UN Owen as a mysterious signature, but there you go. Anyway, each of these people is invited by this mysterious person to a house party on an island. And on the island we have a couple more archetypes. We have a butler and his wife. So you have 10 people. And that fits in with the fact that the whole thing is themed around... Agatha Christie went through a phase of theming her novels around children's nursery rhymes. You have a lot of them from a certain phase of her career where they have titles drawn from nursery rhymes or bits of poetry, famous bits of poetry. You have Hickory Dickory Dock and By the Pricking of My Thumbs. And this is one of those. The title, another diversion. The title is an interesting one in itself.
We have to talk about this.
We have to talk about this, yeah. The title that the story goes by now is And Then There Were None. That's not the original title. The original title, as it was published in 1939, was... I'm not going to say it, but obviously what I say is not what it actually was. I'm paraphrasing. The original title in 1939 was 10 Little N-Words. And that was just published, just perfectly normal. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody white, anyway, thought anything of it. That was published as a mass-published novel.
It didn't fly in the States even then, though, did it? When it was published in the States, I believe it was 10
That's
Little...
right.
It's never been published in the States, is that?
Yeah, it was never published under that title in the United States, was it? Was it? I think it was published as 10 Little Indians.
That's exactly
in the United States. Yeah. It got somewhere along the line that the story got retitled 10 Little Indians, and then of course history progressing the way it does, very very slowly and haltingly. Eventually, somebody realised actually that's still pretty racist. 10 Little Indians, still pretty racist. So now it's called And Then There Were None, and we've kind of all just decided to pretend that it wasn't called that. But it was called that because it's based upon a nursery rhyme, which is apparently a real nursery rhyme from the 19th century, called 10 Little N-Words, which is about it's one of those peculiar nursery rhymes which are about children dying horrible deaths.
Yeah.
This is a subgenre of nursery rhymes, and wonderfully parodied by Edward Gorey in the Gashly Crumb Tinies. But yeah, it's a story about 10 little N-words, and it's a nursery rhyme, and in the course of the poem, they all die horrible deaths.
Yeah, it's like that sort of ring. It's like a sort of ring of roses, 10 green bottles kind of cross of that, isn't it? It's both those things.
Absolutely, and they all die, and the last line of the nursery rhyme is, "And then there were none." So, what's happened is that these 10 people, that's the 8 guests and the 2 servants, have been lured to this island, and they start dying. They start dying one by one, and that's the book basically. They die one by one until they're all dead, and you get a lot of business in between, obviously, because they realize what's happening, and they start to realize that they're being picked off one by one. Somebody's murdering them, and then they realize that the mysterious UN Owen isn't hiding on the island. UN Owen is one of them, so you get lots of suspicion and paranoia as their numbers dwindle, and they start getting more and more panicky and strung out. And then, as I say, they all die. And then you get an epilogue in which it's a kind of a 2-part epilogue. The first part of the epilogue is a couple of policemen discussing the case and how baffled they are by it, and filling in some of the details that might have puzzled us from their own inquiries. And then you get another part of the epilogue, which is again a wonderful mix of the sinister and the incredibly naff. It's actually a message in a bottle. Somebody discovered a bottle with a message in it, and it contains a confession. One of the people on the island has written this message about how they were UN Owen and they committed the murders, and they faked their own murder. Well, no, they did. Well, they didn't fake their own murder. They did kill themselves at the end. But one of the tricks of the novel is that the murderer makes the other people on the island think that they're dead before they actually are, and then they go about the rest of the killings. So that's the book. And the deaths are based upon the deaths in the nursery rhyme as well. So there's one of the rhymes in the rhyme is a bee stung one of the 10 little N-words. So what you get in that one is the woman who's murdered on that occasion is killed with an injection of cyanide, I think it is, and the murderer leaves a bumblebee by the body, because it's just the sort of thing that he likes doing. So
yeah, I like that he mimics the bee sting with the syringe, but also just has to release a literal bumblebee. There's something sort of gloriously silly about that. That's
right. There has to be a bee there as well, and it's kind of, again, there's this mixture all the way through of the weird and sinister and the genuinely ridiculous. The characters kind of recognize that this is happening as well. You get some great scenes where one of the characters gets hysterical because she's saying she's realizing that somebody's going to die and it's going to have something to do with bees because they know the nursery rhyme, and she's saying, where's the beehives on this island? Where are the beehives? Where do we go for honey? things like this.
Is that a bit where in that sort of trope of mid 20th century fiction, she actually gets slapped to sort of bring her to her senses?
She does, yes. She starts getting hysterical, and Dr. Armstrong, who's another one of the characters, slaps her across the face, and she actually says thank you to it.
Yep.
Which is great, So yeah, that is the story, and it as I say, it fascinated me from my first reading, and it's never quite stopped fascinating me. And I think people who've listened to me talk on podcasts, they probably know by now that I'm also fascinated by Kubrick's movie of The Shining, and I think that's because I feel like that is a story which has an awful lot going on. I mean, this isn't a controversial observation. It's a story with an awful lot going on subtextually, under the hood. And I feel like there's something about The Shining which really makes it an incredibly meaningful story about just America, about American civilization as a whole. It gets at all sorts of things. It brings in all sorts of implications about the nature of America as kind of a settler colonial project based on patriarchy and the nuclear family and all this sort of stuff. And I feel like I've often asked myself and others the question, what would the British version of that be? What would the British version of The Shining be? And I feel like And Then There Were None is kind of the closest thing to that I know of. It's kind of the closest thing that I know of to a British version of that. An uncanny story, deceptively simple on the surface, but carrying an awful lot of implications that seem to say a lot about British history and British society. So I think that's why it's so fascinating, and it's inherent, as I say, creepiness and uncanniness that it has all the way through it. Because I don't think the way its own account of itself is actually very satisfactory, and that creates a very strange atmosphere because it claims to be all wrapped up rationally at the end, all the loose ends tied up, but actually the revelation is completely unbelievable. It's completely unsatisfying. So essentially you get to the end and it's still a complete mystery what has gone on, which I love, even though technically speaking that's a failure on the part of the novel.
Yeah, well, it's so much to go into there, and I've got a few thoughts about things that this book reminds me of. So I mentioned before, I was reading this for the first time, just read it in sort of 3 settings over the last sort of week. Had a really good time with it, really enjoyed it, and didn't know. I think I'd seen the 60s adaptation of it, but long enough ago that I didn't really remember who done it, and also wasn't sure how faithful an adaptation that was. So basically, I was watching it with a couple of memories. There were some bits I was like, I kind of know where this is going at times, but not because I was second guessing it, just because I remembered bits of that adaptation. In fact, it's funny you talk about The Shining and about this being a parallel British version of that in some senses. The 60s movie version is set in a sort of a snow enclosed resort, isn't it? It's an island in that sense, in the sense that the Overlook is, which is interesting. Just to oh God, there's gonna be so many things I want to bring into this, and I think a lot of the things I want to bring into it are things that it then influenced rather than the other way around. So I don't know if that's almost like a bit gauche, but like just because you brought it up, talking about the structure of it, like the epilogue and the sort of dual epilogue. So firstly, that reminded me of Psycho.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's in there, and I think even the dual nature of it in a way where you get the kind of uber rational cop explanation or not explanation, but kind of like analysis of it. That's very the first epilogue of Psycho, and then you get the inside the mind of the killer epilogue, which is the second bit of the epilogue of Psycho as well. So that it strikes me that Robert Bloch or Hitchcock were drawing on this book a bit. The other thing, I'm not sure in which order to do this. Let's do one of the obvious ones first, right? Because we started off the podcast by talking about sort of sci-fi horror and things like that. The bit when it's becoming apparent to them that the murderer is in their midst, and that they should do things like not go out of each other's sight and things like that. I was almost expecting them to start doing blood tests in a little petri dish.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
because it's that, isn't it? Like it really is a model for The Thing, isn't it? Like for John Carpenter's The Thing. and it's funny because I knew so little about this. So the moment I started seeing the parallel, I was like, both in terms of the actual plot and the paranoia and everything, but kind of the dreadful mood as well, and obviously the isolation as well. I mean, I presume people have talked about that. I mean, about the parallel there. In the thing.
Well, one thing I should have said actually when I was relaying the plot is that they're on this island and they're stranded there because UN Owen has set it up so that the guy who usually takes a boat out to the island every day doesn't do so. And also, very, very luckily for UN Owen, a great big storm develops, which is another thing about the book that belies its apparent rational explanations. It really does rely upon there being a massive storm to make them stranded there without any possibility of escape. And there's no way rationally that the murderer could have known that was going to happen. I mean, I suppose you could have him looking at weather reports, but that doesn't, I don't buy that. So that's another way in which the story is kind of behind its own back. It is kind of inherently supernatural or uncanny. But yeah, I'm not aware of much criticism of this book, actually. There isn't really much serious literary criticism of Agatha Christie, certainly not in the English language. She's taken a bit more seriously as a subject of literary criticism in France, I believe, where, of course, they're reading her in translation, which I think is part of why they are inclined to take her a bit more seriously as a novelist than we are, because she's a very good writer in some ways. Like the opening of this book, it's kind of stunning for its efficiency.
Yeah.
Because she has 8 characters to introduce, and she needs to do it in short order. And the opening of the book is literally just character introduction, character introduction, character introduction, character introduction, 8 times.
Edit. It struck me as like a TV pilot,
Yeah. And each introduction is incredibly short and economical and really, really good, really efficient. Like, you get to the end of the first chapter and it hasn't gone on too long. You're not bored, but you've met 8 completely separate and completely different characters, and you know exactly who each one of them is. No question. You have a mental picture of them. Really, really efficient. So she's a good writer in that respect. On a sentence level, there is a line in this book. It's in reference to one of the characters, Judge Wargrave, where she says, allowing his head to nod, he nodded off, which is just terrible. I mean, how do you write that? How does that get through 2 drafts? How does that get past an editor? What the hell happened? This is one of the best-selling authors she's probably the best-selling author in history. There'll never be an author who sells more than her, simply because of the way the world and publishing has changed. So for the rest of human history, she's going to be the biggest selling author, the most read author in human history. And that's that. She does stuff like that all the time. So she's not a great writer in that way, but she is really, really good at telling stories. That's one thing you can't take away from her. She's really great at introducing characters, making you know exactly who they are, getting them to speak for themselves, and getting into a story that hooks your interest. That's why she's this supreme popular novelist, But in France, they read her in translation, so she gets filtered through other writers, who, of course, she's filtered into the French language, and she's filtered through other writers' sensibilities. And I think what happens is that some of those horrible roadblocks that we encounter when we read her in the original English, they get smoothed out. So she's taken a bit more critically seriously in France. But I'm not aware of. I mean, obviously, she's a writer with a huge cultural profile, a huge cultural footprint, but she's not really a studied writer, except for 1 or 2 texts. You mentioned the Murder of Roger Ackroyd. That is a text that does get studied because it has this at the center of its form. It has this incredible formal trick, and it really is just a trick. It depends upon withholding information from the audience that comes from the first-person narrator.
Yeah.
And it depends upon the way they frame things. And literally the way their thoughts and the way they relay their actions are phrased very, very carefully at certain key points in the story. So that's literally how the plot works formally. And it pulls off this amazing trick in its final act that's dependent upon this really virtuoso use of form. And that's why that's why that book gets studied. But I don't think Christie as a whole gets that much in-depth study or criticism in the Academy, you know. So I think The Thing has been studied more probably than Agatha Christie. Yeah. So I dare say that in criticism of The Thing, there's a lot of stuff that draws attention to it as being formally similar to a whodunit or in some respects a locked room mystery.
Yeah, well, it's I suppose the striking thing about spoiling The Thing as well. Obviously, there's something about the no one gets out alive thing, isn't there? You know, like which is the presumed ending of The Thing. Obviously, we don't quite know, but you can almost imagine an inferior version of John Carpenter's The Thing ending with a couple of FBI agents sort of talking about what happened here. You know,
that's right. Yeah, message in a bottle.
There's something else. A few things else I wanted to mention, but the epilogue structure. I can never say the word properly, but epistolary, you know, of a letter. It's Dr. Jekyll, isn't it? It's ending the book with that, you know, which is another thing I've heard enough of you talking about to know that you're fascinated with. Absolutely,
another novel that I'm absolutely fascinated by. Rents a permanent room in my head. You're absolutely right. That ends with. In its final section, it switches to a first-person account by Dr. Jekyll of what's been happening, which, again, people who've seen adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde but not read the novel might be surprised by how it's formally couched, because in the book, it's presented as a mystery. In most adaptations, what you actually sort of follow Dr. Jekyll creating his potion and trying it out and becoming Mr. Hyde, etc., etc. Whereas in the novel, it's very much presented as a mystery. You have Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, who is he's kind of in a detective role, and he's trying to figure out what's going on with his friend Henry Jekyll and Dr. Jekyll's weird protege, Mr. Hyde. And a murder comes into it. Mr. Hyde commits a murder. And then you get a double epilogue, very much like And Then There Were None, where first you get the first-person account from Dr. Lanyon,
isn't it?
Yeah, and then it's followed by the first-person account of Dr. Jekyll post-mortem. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. You were talking about the weird mood of this, and this is like a whole other topic. I think you were already highlighting some of the ways in which it calls on sort of ghost story moods and I found, as I say, reading this for the first time, I found it quite chilling. Actually, I found it very effective on that level, particularly. And there's definitely some things to bring up there in terms of sort of like classic Gothic stories and novels that it draws upon a bit. I was thinking particularly for the more, shall we say, haunted characters. But one thing that this put me in mind of in terms of mood and eeriness and kind of that hinted at supernaturalism, but in a sort of staid, traditional middle class sort of setting, was actually Picnic at Hanging Rock. It felt very, like that, and there's a lot of bits, particularly with the sort of, was it you mentioned before? This is where I'm glad I've written them down. It was Vera Claythorne and stuff. Some of the thoughts and visions, and particularly the end of the main narrative, just before the epilogue, the way that ends with her character, that felt very Picnic at Hanging Rock to me. And that's a book and a film I really love. And there's a shot through sort of cursed feel to the settings in that, isn't there? To the sort of both the sort of formal, fusty settings of the sort of school and also to the sort of more isolated geographical settings and stuff. You feel like you're on haunted ground. And this felt like it was prefiguring that book / film a bit for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never read the book. Actually, I have seen the film, but only once, quite a while ago. So I can't really speak to the similarities. But I think, from what I remember, I think there's a very similar affect. Certainly with the whole the way in which the tinge of the supernatural is connected to the idea of personal secrets, and the way in which people in polite society or mainstream society, people who fit into a hierarchy, let's put it that way, because this book is intensely concerned with class and class position and the way in which the entire social system of class in Britain in the middle of the 20th century, how that functions, and how incredibly hard it is to actually stop it functioning. It keeps on functioning almost all the way through as events get more and more bloody and desperate and weird and grotesque. The class system is really the last thing. It's the last barrier to fall. So completely essential is it to these characters' existence, their entire psychology. But yeah, there's the interaction of that class position, personal position within the hierarchy, one's knowledge of where one fits, one's knowledge of propriety, how you appear to others and how you treat others, and the interaction between that and personal secrets. This is another thing this goes all the way through Christie's work, this concentration upon the clash between the interior secrets of the individual and their own awareness of guilt and their own awareness of shame, and the clash between that and how they appear to other people in the world. And that is absolutely, of course, shot through with the ideology and the consciousness of class, and arguably nowhere more intensely than in this novel. So yeah, what you have is it's kind of a three-way dynamic where you have class at one angle, individual psychology at another angle, and then on the other you have the crime or the shame or the secret, to put it that way. And certainly in the case of, because you have all these different characters and they all have different relationships with their crimes, because that's another thing I left out when I did the plot summary. The point is that they're all summoned to this island to be picked off one by one because they have all killed somebody. They are all murderers. The murderer of them has brought them there to be punished, to be executed for the murders that they themselves have committed. Yeah. And the idea is that they're the sorts of murders that are hard to discover, hard to prosecute, hard to punish.
Yeah. And in some cases aren't even classified as murder by polite society.
Aren't even recognised as murder. Yeah. So there's loads to say about that. But yeah, it's the relationship between your personal psychology, your secret shame, the murder you committed, the crime you committed, and your position in the class hierarchy. That triangle, that is really the central concern of the book. Not every character gets the same attention paid to their psychology. Agatha Christie isn't the slightest bit interested in the psychology of the two servants, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. Not interested.
That stood out a bit to me.
Yeah, absolutely. We get some stuff about how Mrs. Rogers, she seems desperately unhappy. She's described actually by one of the characters as looking defeated, which is an interesting description. And it is implied, I think it's faintly implied, that she is at least dominated, if not abused, by her husband, Rogers, the butler. And that's a faint implication in the book that, of course, the 2018 TV adaptation just completely goes to town with, because it that's what it does. It turns everything up to 11. In the book, there is an implication there, and of her being desperately haunted and remorseful about a crime that she probably didn't really have much say in anyway. She's probably she's the person who dies almost first, because one of the things the murderer does is they assess the level of guilt of each person, and they decide who dies first and who dies last based on that, because the people who are most guilty have to die last because they have to suffer the fear and anticipation for as long as possible, and the people who are less guilty for the murderer's own assessment, which is interesting in itself, they get to die first. And Mrs. Rogers is among the first to die because I suppose she's considered to be less culpable because basically she didn't have any say in it.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that, because if if you were to take the epilogue, the letter epilogue, the confession epilogue at face value, which question marks again, the killer's view of what constitutes guilt and whether it's his assessment of that or the impact of their quasi crime on them, that's all a question mark, I think.
Yeah. The letter that's the last thing we read in the novel purports to be a confession by the killer, and we've given you enough spoiler warnings. The killer, at least as far as the book presents things to you, is the judge, Justice Wargrave.
Yeah.
You have Mr. Justice Wargrave. You have Mr. Blore, who's the cop. You have Dr. Armstrong. You have Vera Claythorne, who's the governor's secretary. You have Philip Lombard, who's the criminal. You have, who else have you got? Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, I mentioned. You have Emily Brent, who's kind of the old maid, the spinster. And you have Anthony Marsden, who's the incredibly good-looking young wastrel.
Yeah.
I think that's everybody.
By the way, sidebar on Marsden, how weird is that, not quite introduction to the reader of him, but his introduction to the rest of the characters when they're gathered at the dock waiting to go to the island, when he drives up?
Yes. Well, she's incredibly horny for the two young male characters in this. For Anthony Marsden, who is described sort of insistently as young and virile and powerful and healthy and bronzed and blonde and blue-eyed and just fucking gorgeous. He's described as like a Norse god, exactly. At the height of his youth and power and virility. She's she's really into this.
But that's the mention of the Norse god thing and that weird scene. It kind of makes his early death seem like some sort of weird mystical sacrifice as well, doesn't it? Almost like, sacrificing the quote-unquote best of us, or as you say, like the proudest of us, or the most, Scandinavian European of us, or whatever. It gives that a weird mysticism as well, a kind of weird pull.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's also the youngest of them all as well. So it is very much the sacrifice of the young, the young man, and the ostensible, because Justice Wargrave ostensibly writes a letter at the end, just before he kills himself, and puts it in a bottle and throws it into the ocean, and that's his confession. You can decide for yourself whether you find his account of events, or even if it is his account. You can decide for yourself if you find that satisfactory. I don't think it's satisfactory at all, which opens up all sorts of interesting ways to read the text. You are deliberately reading the text against the grain if you do that, but that's fine, we can do that. But the account that we get at the end, supposedly from Wargrave, about why he kills Marsden first, is that Marsden is completely amoral. He has no sense of morality. He's actually described as in line with the thing where he's described as looking like a Norse god. In the letter, he's described as a pagan.
An amoral pagan, yeah, I noted that down as well.
Yeah, he's explicitly couched in unchristian terms. He doesn't ken Christian morality. He's like a survival of pre-Christianity. So of course, Christianity being the basis of all true morality, he doesn't have a moral center. He doesn't have a moral sense.
That reminded me of living in our day and age. That reminded me a little bit of the sort of Boris Johnson type. Like it's almost like they're sort of condemning him and excusing him at the same time. Sort of saying, well, he just doesn't know how to care about people. He just can't grasp that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that's something that the world does. I mean, the world does find incredible latitude and forgiveness for young, pretty, wealthy white people. It really does, And so there's this weird combination of intense vengeful justice and at the same time still that instinct to kind of let this kind of person off the hook, because the letter at the end lets him off the hook morally. It's almost like he didn't know it was wrong to speed round country roads and kill small children. There's a fascinating line where he's actually pulled up by one of the other characters, Dr. Armstrong, about driving too fast. And he just shrugs his shoulders and says, speed is here to stay. I love that line because that's
Yeah.
another one of the hints of the changing world and the oncoming of the modern world that we know. But yeah, he's not. And when they talk about the fact that he killed these two children on the road because he was speeding, he says, "Oh, it's bad luck." And somebody actually says to him, "What, for you or for them?" And he says, "Well, for them, obviously, but I was thinking of myself." He just says that.
Yeah, funny.
Um,
Isn't it weird that he's the first to die, as you say, and
Exactly.
he's guilty of killing, kind of by accident, but killing two children, and Vera Claythorne is the last to die, and she's guilty of killing a child.
Yes. Yeah. And the rationale of the ostensible killer is that Marsden is he's so completely unaware of morality that he can't really be said to have knowingly transgressed. I think that's the idea. So, there's some interesting philosophy of morality there. He's defied the Kantian maxim, the categorical imperative. His action couldn't be generalized as a universal truth. So, drive too fast. It's fine.
Yeah. Well, you're almost talking about an inversion of the noble pagan thing, aren't you? We talked about pagans before. Like the noble pagan, the virtuous pagan, but exists before Christ, so can't be a true, redeemed person. This is almost like the ignoble pagan, right? But it's the inverse, where you can't blame them too hard because Christ does not yet exist.
Yeah, he can't be fully condemned because he hasn't had the light of Christianity shed upon him. So yeah, that really is the book is incredibly confused, but interestingly confused about what constitutes morality. And he's killed first because he's so completely unaware of morality that apparently he doesn't deserve to suffer the terror of waiting to die. He's just kind of this unfortunate creature that needs to be disposed of, but no real punishment. It's like euthanizing a dog that's bitten somebody. That's how it feels.
Can we talk a little bit about General MacArthur as a character?
Oh yeah,
because that's fascinating. I found that one of the most fascinating bits of the novel, and I like the way they deal with the character of Vera Claythorne, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But like, they kind of do a slightly less overtly horror kind of treatment of his character, insight into his sin and his guilt, and then he becomes this very eerie figure, doesn't he? Like, becomes this sort of weirdly haunted figure, and dies earlier in the story than Vera does. But I really liked that, and part of what I liked about it was that his sin, his murder, if you like, and what drove him to it, and what his life's been since, is just so desperately empathetically sad. I found.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a really interesting character. Again, he's one of the first to die, because I think there is, the ostensible killer makes a judgment about him that he doesn't deserve the protracted punishment that some of the others are going to suffer. And his crime is he discovers while he's fighting in the First World War, and again, this book is obsessively haunted by the First World War. He discovers while he's away fighting in the First World War that his wife, his much younger wife, has been having an affair with one of his junior officers, with whom he's quite friendly. He introduced this younger officer to his wife, for instance, and he discovers that they've been having an affair. And in just desperate betrayal and jealousy, what he does is he sends the officer on a suicide mission, basically. Because he's the CO in that section of trench, and he sends this officer. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it's in the context of the war. There's men dying all around him every day, and presumably this is a necessary mission. Somebody had to go on this mission, so somebody would have died. It's up to him to choose who dies, and he chooses. And it's not the way he thinks about it. It's not that he's thinking, "I'll get rid of him. I'll get him out of the way, and then I'll have my wife back." It's just desperate hurt. It's just desperate pain and rage that's at this betrayal by both of them, really.
But also calculated. It's not like he does it the same day or something. Like he has slept on this plan for a bit when you're told that he's done it. He's been nice to him and stuff like that for weeks or months.
Yeah. But at the same time, he had to send somebody off to die on this mission, So there's a really interesting thing there where, whoever he would have sent on this mission would have died. And he probably sends, the book actually says, commanding officers in the war at that stage were sending people off to die every day. Somebody actually says that. So you have the implication that just the conduct, just the normal conduct of war is just a series of murders. Just giving orders as a CO in the course of war is just murder, 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 murder. And that's just the routine reality of it. Or, if you want to look at it, it's more the way the book texturally looks at it, which is that's duty. That's perfectly fine. It becomes murder when you deliberately send a specific person for personal reasons.
When it's personal, it's murder. When it's impersonal, it's fine.
Yeah. Again, the book is really confused, but interestingly confused about the ethics of this, about what constitutes a murder and what doesn't. Because one of the really crucial things about this book, the things that make it really interesting, is that all these murders that these people have committed or supposedly committed, they're kind of impersonal. Very few of them are with people who are very close. You have Lombard kills some native tribesmen, as they're described.
Yeah.
So they're not friends, they're not family or anything like that. Armstrong kills a woman who he's operating on by being drunk when he operates on her. So again, he doesn't know.
That was the Alien 3 bit, by the way.
Absolutely, yeah. Clemens does the same thing. But he doesn't know her. She's not a friend of his or anything. Emily Brent kills a young woman that's working for her. MacArthur kills one of the officers under his command. Vera kills the little boy that she's the governess of. The Rogers kill an old lady that they're working for, and they do it by inaction. They do it by withholding medicine that she needs. They do it by not going to the doctor to get this medicine that she needs. And Blore just he's a policeman at the time. He frames somebody for a bank robbery, and the guy dies in prison. So there's something impersonal about all these murders. There's something a bit distant about them. A lot, even the ones that are with people who are close to the killer. Vera doesn't kill the little boy Cyril because she hates him, although it's implied that she does. Yeah. She kills him because she just needs him to not be there, so that the young man she's in love with can inherit the house and money that otherwise Cyril is going to inherit. So it's a lot of the murder, and of course Marsden, as I was saying, he just runs down some kids because he's driving too fast. Yeah. So a lot of these murders they're one step removed. They're not that this person is directly killing this other person because they hate them. They're not killing wives. They're not killing parents. Things like that. And a lot of the murders are through accident or negligence or inaction. Or the murder takes place at one remove. A man happens to die in prison after he's framed. So that's part of the point, isn't it?
Brief sideline to that. I mean, going back to sort of 1920s, 30s fiction, it reminds me of that. I'll get it badly wrong here, but that famous Great Gatsby line about careless people smashing things up and retreating to the sort of private fortresses and stuff. This is almost like a book full of people who've been careless, right, or like acted rashly or meanly. And then they've retreated into themselves essentially. And the thing I find so interesting about MacArthur and Vera's character and everything like that is they are just these desperately twistedly sad people who, in a sense, this big theme I suppose we can come back to, who quote unquote got away with it, but didn't really get away with it in their hearts. Basically, their lives are mangled and destroyed essentially. Before they come to the island.
Yes, and you get that in the prologue. So I was talking about the first chapter where you meet them all. I think every one of them is thinking about. Well, as I say, we don't meet the two servants because Christie isn't interested in the psychology or emotional or moral lives of servants, but you meet the 8 real people, the middle class people, and every one of them is to one extent or another thinking about the things that they've done. Vera is thinking about, she's thinking mainly about Hugo, which is the guy that she wanted.
Yeah.
And that's why she killed the little boy to get him out of the way so that this guy Hugo could have the money. And then Hugo kind of suspects what she did and runs a mile. But she's thinking about him, but she is still haunted by what she did. And to one extent or another, they all are. Even Lombard, who's a pretty cold, remorseless case, he has lots of thoughts about being in tight places. There's lots of implications in his interior monologue about stuff that he's done in the past. So they are all, to a certain extent, haunted by it. And yeah, you're right. The Buchanans in Great Gatsby, they would fit very well into this crowd of people, smashing up things and people and then retreating into their money. That's the line.
You could do a meta literary version of "And Then There Were None," where you the 10 people who end up on the island are all characters from other literature. Who have got away with things in those respective books.
Yes, I love that. That's fantastic. Yeah, pastiche, where somebody invites all these characters, like
incredibly guilty characters.
Yeah, that's fantastic. But MacArthur, I think, is also, you were talking about MacArthur, and he's probably the most genuinely remorseful. He is genuinely haunted by what he did. And he thinks about how, he didn't used to be. He actually thinks about how at the time I was fine with it. He deserved it. But it didn't benefit him. He didn't get his relationship with his wife back because she always felt unreal to him after that. And then she died and he's just been left all alone. And, people kind of suspect him, so they look at him funny. And he's just been miserable. He really gained nothing by what he did. And by the time we meet him, he's really the first one who realizes what's happening. He kind of just says, "Good, I want out. I'm done with it. I don't want to keep doing this." And he just basically plonks himself down and says, "Come on then, I'm ready to go." And there is something there's an interesting reaction because Vera talks to him after he's decided that he just wants to let it happen, and he says something like that, and she's absolutely horrified. She absolutely recoils with revulsion at that feeling of resignation. So what she's really recoiling from is conscious remorse, I think, which is really interesting.
Well, and also the idea of, as you say, giving up on life. Like, I think that there's something quite Catholic. I don't know enough about Agatha Christie's religion and sort of background stuff, but there feels like there's something quite Catholic about this, at least in a sort of pop cultural Catholic kind of way. And I was thinking in terms of MacArthur. Did you see the Scorsese movie The Irishman a few years ago?
No, I haven't watched that.
Ah, right. Well, no specific spoilers, but in that Robert De Niro plays for most of the narrative an elderly character who has this violent past, and it's kind of MacArthur's character being this person who did these brutal things, or did this one brutal thing, if we're to accept that as the one brutal thing he did rather than his entire career. But then did it kind of for naught, because that's a big part of The Irishman is like, it's spoil specifics, but like people do these things and then perhaps the reasons they did them go away unconnectedly, and obviously age is just that process anyway. The reasons for which you originally did things tend to fade away bit by bit, and you end up with these very kind of like in a lot of other Scorsese movies, and gangster movies specifically, where you end up with these old men who are kind of ridiculous and pathetic now, but they used to be these brutal killers, and now and the quote unquote lucky ones who survive just get this kind of protracted hollow existence, and it feels very, very heavily moral. And that's what MacArthur reminded me of, that kind of like gangster figure, the gangster who's unlucky enough to live, basically. Yeah,
and I think that's kind of true of a lot of the characters in this, isn't it? That in many ways, the crueler than inviting them to an island and killing them in a bizarre nursery rhyme style way, the crueler thing would be to just let them carry on, because certainly a lot of them seem pretty miserable. MacArthur is just this retired old guy, and he's got nothing. And he's Claythorne she's just a teacher in, as she describes it, a third-rate school. So she's had to her punishment for her crime is that she's no longer a governess with sort of honorary family status to a very well-to-do family. She's had to descend the class ladder to the point where she's now a games mistress at a pretty low-rent public school, which is, a fate worse than death, it's implied.
Yeah. Well, she seems to be on the track of old maid spinster already. She's one of those. Is she like a sort of late 20s, early 30-something character or something who now seems doomed, because she didn't get Hugo, is now just done for? That's kind of that was her shot.
Yeah, I think there's a degree to which she's horrified by Emily Brent, and it's on the surface it's because Emily Brent is so completely unconscious of having done anything wrong. What she did was she had a maid who got pregnant, and Emily Brent turned her out, just fired her and chucked her out, and then the young woman drowned herself in the river, and she's completely self-righteous and completely satisfied with her decision, no consciousness of guilt whatsoever. And texturally, the reason that Vera finds her intensely disturbing when she learns that. And texturally, the reason is that remorselessness, that judgmental Christian, that sort of very cold, remorseless Christian morality, and complete self-satisfaction. But I think really the thing that she finds disturbing about Emily Brent is that Emily Brent she kind of sees her own future there, I think. Yeah, and Blore, again, he's gone from being a policeman to being this kind of slightly ridiculous private detective in Portsmouth, So a lot of them, you get the feeling that, as I say, they're already being punished, and their punishment is that their crimes haven't really availed them anything. They haven't achieved anything by them.
Socially elevated them.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I suppose, maybe the worst thing, not to be snarky about it, but the worst thing Christie can imagine is committing a murder and not gaining social traction from it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. To go to all that trouble and then to go down in the social hierarchy, to end up on a snake rather than a ladder.
Something magical about an island.
Yeah, like a little world of its own.
How would you like to spend your last days here?
Oh, no thanks. I think a weekend will be enough. 10 little Indians.
One choked his little self, and they're never nigh.
Uh-huh. Go on.
One overslept himself, and there were 8.
Mr. Owen is one of us.
You have to do that.
I'm just studying Mr. Owen's little scheme.
Maybe you know how the general was killed.
My dear Blore, can't you read? 8 little Indian boys traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7.
7 little Indians left.
6. One is bogus.
Correct, sir. One of us is Mr. Owen.
Which one?
7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half, and then there were 6.
There are 5 of us left. One of us is a murderer.
I get it.
One little Indian boy left all alone. Какой ужас. So he went and hanged himself, and then there were none.
Well, can we talk a little bit about, because we were sort of dancing around it a little bit, talk about Vera Claythorne's murder, because that is properly horrific, isn't it? And it's very sad as well, but it's the child that she allows to drown, basically. Very strategically, very calculatedly, and that's one of the bits where repeatedly, like the ghost story elements you were talking about, really come back into it, don't they? In a way where, I was very much thinking of Wuthering Heights, for example. There's a lot of that in it.
Yeah, there's really two strains where the uncanny, ghostly inflection comes in, and those are interestingly enough, they're the two middle-class female characters, Emily Brent and Vera Claythorne. As I say, Emily Brent's crime is that she mercilessly turned out this young woman who got pregnant, and the young woman committed suicide, and she feels haunted. Despite her ostensible complete lack of remorse and her ostensible complete self-satisfaction with her own actions, she does obviously feel haunted because she has dreams about this young woman. And again, as a kid reading this for the first time, these are some of my favorite bits. These are some of the things that are completely burned into my memory. They're part of why I really dug the book first time off. She has dreams about that girl coming back, and outside the window, this pale, wet face staring in at the window, and asking to be let in. And there's even a bit like she imagines wet footprints on the carpet and things like that. Like the girl is still wet from the river that she threw herself into, and she's coming back. Great stuff. I love it.
Well, it's Kathy and everything, but it's the ring as well. If you flash forward, isn't it? It's the revenant from the water. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Agatha Christie actually wrote some fairly good supernatural fiction. She had a collection called The Hound of Death. There's some pretty good ghost stories she wrote. But yeah, the other really supernatural tinge to it comes via Vera Claythorne, as you were saying. And again, it's interesting, isn't it? It's another water death. In both cases, it's drowning. And in Vera Claythorne's case, what she does is, as I say, this kid that she's the governess for in this obviously well-to-do family, because he was born, he is going to be the one who inherits the house and all the money from somebody or other, instead of this other chap, his cousin or uncle or something, Hugo, who's much older, and she's having a romance with Hugo. And it isn't really explicitly stated that they can't get married. She feels like she wants Hugo to have the money if she's going to marry him. Her interpretation or her way of phrasing it to herself is that he needs the money so that he can marry her. But that's, I don't know, the book is ambiguous about that. I don't think that's necessarily true. She just wants him to have the money. And
it seems like she has been an unhinged character from the start of her story, essentially, doesn't it? There's been something odd about her.
Yeah, there's this strong sense of self-delusion running through a lot of these people. As I say, Emily Brent is obviously deluded about her level of guilt. Consciously, she's not feeling guilty, but obviously she is, because she's having these very frightening dreams about this girl coming back. And again, Vera Claythorne, the way she thinks about this thing that she did all the time. She thinks about Hugo, this guy she lost, and about little Cyril saying, "Miss Claythorne, why can't I swim out to the rock? Why can't I swim out to the rock?" This is preying on her mind. And she's constantly trying to interpret and reinterpret and contextualize her own actions and reassure herself about her level of responsibility or the level at which she might be found out, So what she does is one day she gives in to this kid who's constantly pestering her to be allowed to swim out to this distant rock from the beach, and he's not very strong, and she knows, as the responsible adult that's tasked with looking after him, that that's incredibly dangerous. So she says no, and then one day she just finds herself saying, "Yes, all right then," and lets him go out to the rock. And her memories of that action, they're quite chilling, because she's actually going through it in her own mind. She's actually thinking, what if he survives? He'll say that I told him he could swim to the rock. And then she thinks to herself, yes, but I can just say he's lying. I can just say, how can you tell such outrageous lies, Cyril? And they'll believe me, not him.
Yeah.
So it's pretty damn cold-blooded. And she pretends to be trying to rescue him.
Yeah.
She actually swims out with this pretense of trying to rescue him.
It's
as well.
horrible. It's really horrible.
Yeah.
Like in a way that I mean, obviously an axe to the back of the head isn't nice, but it's really calculated and horrible. This is just an observation sort of about the book as a whole. But one chill that I got from reading this, and this is in praise of the book, and one thing I enjoyed as a horror was, I guess I've not been used to reading that much detective or crime fiction where the crimes that they're all guilty of, the pre-island crimes that they are guilty of, that they're not outlandish. They're like the opposite, and that they kind of, it gave me that chill of like, I'm probably I don't want to be overly paranoid about human nature or the reality we live in or the society we live in, but I was kind of like, when I was reading it, at least I was like, I'm probably surrounded by people who've done things like this. Like I was reading some of it in a pub one afternoon, and I was like, all these people could have done stuff like this. I was getting it over my head a little bit. I was kind of like, this, but because what I mean is, in the epilogue, when the detectives are talking and they talk about how they actually talked to Hugo, or they thought somebody talked to Hugo, rather, isn't it? And he talks about Vera, and he talks about Vera after the kid drowned, and he talks about like he talked to her and he knew, he knew what she'd done basically. And he felt it, and that's why he couldn't feel the same about her, or couldn't go near her or look at her again, really, and that's why he didn't, he left her essentially, didn't talk to her again, but he didn't have any proof, and how would he even in this kind of thing? How would there be proof? It's not that sort of crime, and it's not a crime, arguably, and it's kind of, but it is a sin, it's getting back to that Catholic thing, the stink of sin is on these people, it's like MacArthur's feeling, you talk about, it's like the "who would notice another madman around here" line from Blackadder.
Absolutely.
He sort of murdered someone in the middle of the First World War, and even though that would be that's like the most undetectable thing you can possibly do under guise of duty, as well as you say, in order, and hierarchy. He seems sort of obsessed by the idea that people do know, like that people, everyone around him, everyone in his village knows, everyone at the village fete knows that he shuns society now because. Clearly it's guilt preying on him, but it's so unfeasible that people would know, really. What would they know? But Christie's portraying this world in which people sort of do, and I don't think that's even wrong necessarily. I think that's psychologically really interesting. I think there must be so many things like this in real life where people do these things that are hugely wrong, and you essentially quietly cut them off after that, but these things that maybe arguably should be in a court of law or some sort of restorative justice, people just sort of get on with it, but they put distance between each other. It just struck me as very, very chilling. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's one of the interesting things about the novel is that it is more about sin than about crime. I think that's why a lot of these murders are kind of impersonal or at one remove, the way that they are, and they're all tied to specific forms of selfishness, aren't they? Like obviously MacArthur's. I mean, you could even try to sort of map sins directly onto them, a bit like in Seven.
I thought Seven might come up. Yeah.
MacArthur is animated specifically by jealousy, sexual jealousy, romantic jealousy. Vera very much by greed. I think subtextually what she's more interested in is Hugo and the money than Hugo. Lombard's an interesting one because what he does is he abandons men to die, to starve in the bush. He's got like native tribesmen, quote unquote, that he's using as guides or, whatever, Sherpas or something like that. And they get into some sort of situation, and he and the other white men, they take the food and bugger off, and they leave these guys to die.
Yeah, that's horrifying as well. Just like how quickly that's described, and then you get away from it.
Yeah. And his response is, he says something like, not exactly the actions of a pucker Saab, but self-preservation is is a man's first duty. And then he has some wonderful stuff about natives don't mind dying, they don't feel it the way we do.
Yeah.
Which it'd be very tempting to tie that into. I mean, it is clearly a racist novel because, as I mentioned, it was originally called 10 Little N-Words, and it's based around this entire nursery rhyme, which uses that word over and over and over again, and makes a sort of joke out of the deaths of black children, essentially. But at the same time, I feel like I don't think that's being condoned. I think that's definitely something that the book is, taking aim at as a kind of self-serving hypocrisy. And I think, a lot of them are like that. There's Rogers has a line about he's actually confronted at one point about the inheritance that he gets from this old lady that he allows to die, and he's very defensive about it. He's very we looked after her, and why shouldn't I get a legacy? It's all very personal. It's all very selfish. And the interesting thing is that when you get to the end, you hear the ostensible confession from Wargrave. His motives are really incredibly personal as well. He describes himself rather incoherently as being a sadist who enjoys inflicting pain and fear, but also having a strong sense of justice.
I know.
So he can't do it to people that don't deserve it. He's got such a strong sense of justice that he can't torture and murder the innocent.
Yeah.
But when somebody has done something bad, it's a free for all.
Well, but by his own account, isn't his quote unquote murder fascinating? Because he's lent on this jury to find this guy guilty in court years ago who was going to get off because his trial was going very well for him. But then in his epilogue, he sort of says, "No, he was actually guilty though." So this is another weird death within the system that's like. So is he the most innocent of them by some measure, or by his own measure, by the book's measure? I don't.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, whatever Christie thought about it, or whatever, so to speak, the book thinks, it's still completely selfish. He has this account of himself where he says, "I have a strong sense of justice. It's repellent to me, the idea that an innocent person should suffer," but. That just feels like a kind of self-excuse, a kind of self-flattery, a kind of self-justification. It's a way of indulging his cruelty and his sadism while still feeling self-righteous, isn't it? But for all that, it's clear that he did this entire thing just because he wanted to, just for fun, basically. He just wanted to kill a load of people. I mean, he basically says that. I became obsessed with the idea of committing a murder. I must commit a murder.
Doesn't he torture insects and things like that? As a kid, he's talking about.
Yes.
Because I see in my notes in block capitals I've got written down. My notes are all over the place, by the way. I might put them in a museum someday. It's crazy, but I've just got written in block capitals during that bit of the epilogue, the Wasp Factory in block capitals.
Yes. I was just going to say exactly that. For a couple of lines in the epilogue, it turns into the Wasp Factory. But it's still, as I say, it's still completely selfish. It's still about enjoyment. It's still about pure sadistic enjoyment and they all have those justifications. They all, well, the old lady was going to die anyway. Why shouldn't she leave me her money? It was war, men were dying all over the place. We had to leave them. They're only natives. I have to preserve myself. Emily Brent, particularly, she's probably the most developed case of self-justification. As we were saying, Marsden is completely it's bad luck, but there you go. They all have these self-exculpations to make themselves feel better.
Well, again, looking ahead to just immediately post-war work, the obvious thing that came up was a play I saw when I was at high school. An Inspector Calls. The group of people who have to have social conscience forced upon them quasi supernaturally, and it's because they all did things that they don't. I know it's slightly different, but they all did things that together add up to a big crime.
Yes.
Obviously, that's making a slightly different point, but
No, I think Inspector Calls is an ancestor text or a precursor text to this. I really do, because as you say, it's tinged with that implication of the supernatural that this has all over it. One of the things I was going to say before I got sidetracked was that Vera Claythorne is the other character who feels most haunted, perhaps in the literal sense, because where Emily Brent has these dreams about the girl that drowned herself coming back and trying to get in the window and stuff like that. Vera Claythorne, she feels haunted by both Cyril, the kid that she killed, and by Hugo. She has the repeated feeling that Hugo is nearby watching her. Now, I know on a functional level, part of what's happening there is that Christie is trying to imply that maybe Hugo is on the island and he's the killer. She's offering us another suspect there. But it creates a very interesting effect where she feels watched by the shade or the memory or the ghost of this guy that she lost. And she also feels that Cyril is there as well. And there's one particularly, again, that this weird mixture of the sinister and the very cod. There's a scene where she goes into her room and she feels what she thinks is a wet hand on her face.
Oh, I know.
And it's very spooky. It's very effective. It's very hairs on the back of your neck sticking up. And then it turns out to be some seaweed that somebody's hung up from the light fixture. How you mistake some seaweed for a hand, I don't know, but there you go.
I think I would if I'd had the weekend they've had.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're not thinking straight. But again, it's that association of death and guilt and drowning and water.
But there are bits like that's one of the bits, but those are bits where the characters are borderline hallucinating, right? It becomes very trippy, it becomes eerie and trippy. But it's almost like the walls are losing their solidity, and that's where it's obviously going full gothic, and it's interesting, because they make the point of mentioning what a normal. They're almost like, I think the authorial voice at one point is like, you're probably picturing like a spooky old gothic house. It wasn't that at all. Very modern and brightly lit and very nondescript and very as unspooky as you could hope for, basically. And I love that because then it becomes such a spooky place.
Well, that's first thing I was going to say was that there's a wonderful bit where Emily Brent is writing in her diary, and she actually she writes something and then she looks down at it and she says, "Did I write that?
Yeah.
I must be going mad," which is great. And then there's another bit where it turns out to be Rogers doing something upstairs, but there's a bit where the three main men, Lombard, Armstrong, and Blore, they hear footsteps upstairs. And before you find out that it's Rogers pottering around in his room, it's a really spooky moment. Because there's this constant feeling. Again, the characters talk about it. They talk about the feeling that there's somebody else there, there's somebody watching them, and you get this sequence where they hear footsteps upstairs. And I think really, if you want to really go full, subtext, metafiction with this book, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of the presence, is really us. They kind of sense us. Watching them. That's how I feel. But yeah, the line you mentioned, I love that line because the actual line in the book is, "The house was the essence of modernity." And I love that because modernity, of course, is a term that means all sorts of things.
Speed is here to stay.
Yeah. At that point in the book, in literal terms, what it means is, everything's very modern. The house isn't an ancient Gothic pile. It's a modern house. It's a new house. Everything's white and clean. It's in the modernist style. It's in the international style. Everything's white and straight lines and all that sort of thing. That was very fashionable in the early part of the 20th century. But of course, modernity has another meaning. It refers to the modern era. It refers to the era of history that came about after the end of feudal or medieval society and the rise of capitalist society. It's really, the term early modern is now used in place of the term Renaissance. So really, at that point in time, where the old world is replaced by the new burgeoning capitalist world, you have the beginnings of the modern world that we live in, and then of course it gets accelerated by the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, saying it's the essence of modernity, that really ties in for me. And again, it's not. I don't think Agatha Christie is doing this deliberately. I don't think she's conscious of this, but it really ties in for me with this feeling that this is a novel very hooked into history, and the history of British society and British culture, and because it's set on an island. It makes a point of being an island, and you have what is effectively a cross-section of British society, a microcosm of British society on an island. So it just inherently invites a metaphorical reading where when you pick up a copy of this book now, it's called Soldier Island because they've changed the nursery rhyme to
10 little soldier
10 little
boys.
soldier boys.
Yeah.
Because, as I say, it started out as 10 little N words.
Can I just ask you that on a really basic writing level? Because my copy's the same, obviously. 10 little soldier boys. Why change it to soldier boys and not soldiers, which scans with the original?
I don't know. I don't know.
Was that actually an alternative version of the rhyme, I suppose, like a cleaner one, cleaner in that sense?
Yeah, I'm sure the original rhyme is just N-word.
Yeah, so soldier
and in the original,
works, doesn't it?
Yeah. In the original version of the book, the island is called N-word Island because ostensibly the outline of the island looks like the profile of a black man.
Oh, I see. So they cut that bit in the text as well that explains that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then they make it a little bit more socially acceptable by making it Indian Island and 10 little Indians. And then, of course, you get a little bit further on into the 20th century and people realize, oh, that's really racist as well. So we need to change it again. But, you can read, it just invites us to read N-word Island as a metaphorical version of Britain itself. Britain, of course, being an island. And the people on the island as a metaphorical sample or microcosm of just British society. And that's where the fact that they have these archetypal identities comes in. As I say, judge, policeman, spinster, teacher, etc. They become like metaphorical figures.
Yeah.
And it's also exacerbated by the fact that they're related to the figures of the soldiers on a sort of ornament in the house. One of the things that happens in the book is that every time one of the humans is killed, some mysterious person comes along and takes one of the little model soldiers off the board. So they're specifically being related to like pieces on a game board. They've become like chess pieces or something like that. And chess is not only a game, it's also a game with figures who are archetypal, who have social identities, archetypes of figures with social roles and social identities, fitting into a very strict hierarchy with rules that govern their ability to move and what they're able to do. And it's also black and white, which ties in with the racial themes of the novel. As I say, toned down now, but you have the name of the island, you have the nursery rhyme, which is it comes from British imperialist ideology, racist imperialist ideology, and then you have Lombard essentially killing these quote unquote natives because they don't feel death or pain the way us humans do. That's essentially what he's saying. So you have these intimations of British racist imperialism. You have a lot of it is about war. As I say, you have General MacArthur talking about the hell of it all in the trenches and about picking out one of the many, many deaths that he ordered in the course of doing his duty as a murder. The war comes up over and over again. One of the younger men thinks to himself, the old buffer will ask me about the war. And it's written in 1939, so it's written at the height of British society knowing that this is happening again. That you have the hideous trauma of World War I still in living memory, very recent living memory.
Yeah.
And they know by this point, pretty much everybody knows at this point when this book comes out that we're going to be at war again.
Yeah.
So you have the desperate scarring memory of World War I, and you have the knowledge that World War II is on the horizon. And what you end up with is that the book, as I say, invites you to read it as a metaphorical microcosm of Britain, as a chessboard where you have race as an incredible factor. You have war and imperialism as an incredible factor, and kind of the organizing principle of the whole thing is social hierarchy. And as I say, the book is intensely concerned with class. the only real psychological effect that we see on Rogers, the butler, is that as he gets more and more unnerved, you hear more of his working class dialect.
I noticed that as well.
He starts out talking in a very correct manner. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please come through the... And by the time he dies, he's using, again, quote unquote, working class figures of speech, because he's losing the pretense. Vera Claythorne is very concerned at the start of the novel to make everybody aware of the fact that she's not a guest, she's a secretary. Things like this, again, all the way through the book. And the class system endures an incredible amount of damage that's done by the murders. So you have it all there. You have an island, you have this cross-section of people, you have the intimation of race and colour, you have war, you have social class, and what you have is on this island, which is organized according to these logics of war and class, what you have is a general slaughter. They all die, and the killer turns out to be the judge. And of all the names that Agatha Christie could have chosen for that character, she decides to call him Wargrave.
Yeah. The moment you pronounced it that way, because I was thinking Wargrave, the moment you pronounced it that way, I was like, oh wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating stuff. That's I suspect we'll be wrapping up before too long, because we've gone quite long on this one. But I kind of wanted to ask you two questions. One more flippant than the other, so I'll get the flippant one out of the way. But the second one touches more on the film adaptations of it that we referenced before cursorily. So my flippant question is, if you're to believe Wargrave's testament at the end, or any of it really, if you're to believe any of the structure of this book and its sort of point or conceits. But what was Wargrave planning to do if Vera Claythorne hadn't taken the revolver and shot Lombard? Was it at that stage?
Lombard, yeah.
Yeah. What was the plan there?
I really don't know. I mean, I think what the book is asking you to believe is that Wargrave had manipulated them into the situation where she would shoot Lombard, and that he knew that would happen. He's
such a good student of human nature that this is practically predestined sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. He again, it's a bit like the Joker in the Dark Knight, where in order for the plot to work, he must have foreseen literally everything that everybody is going to do. He must have contingency plans for one of the policemen at the sting operation where they're moving Harvey Dent. If that policeman drives left, then we do this. If he drives right, then we do that. He must have foreseen every possible sort of on a quantum level, on a chaos theory level. He must know exactly what he does in every possible eventuality in order for the plan to work. And the other thing, of course, is that he's completely reliant on Vera Claythorne coming to the psychological state at the end of the book where she decides to hang herself. Which relies upon her feeling of being haunted, of being manipulated of being invited by Hugo's ghost. It is she does that. We know from her interior monologue that she hangs herself because she feels that she's going to be with Hugo, that he's there and he's asking her to do it. And that's, again, if we're to believe the Wargrave confession at the end, not only are we required to believe the ludicrous account that he gives of faking his own death and then achieving his own death at the end without anybody realizing what he's done, but we're also asked to believe that he's somehow planned that. He's planned the exact sequence of events that takes place with Vera and Lombard and her own psychological reaction, where she goes upstairs and finds a noose and decides, oh yeah, I'll use that.
My headcanon is that in the world of this book, she, like most of this is natural, is real life happenings, realistic happenings, if you like. And Wargrave is an inspired judge of the human condition, shall we say. But also Vera is genuinely haunted by at least one ghost. But Wargrave also knows about that and makes it part of the plan. Which
I love it. I kind of have a headcanon of my own where if this actually happened in the real world, of course it wouldn't because it's ridiculous. But let's say something like this actually happened. This would be one of the most famous mysteries in human history, in culture. You know,
the Netflix series would write itself, wouldn't it? Like...
Yeah, absolutely. In the same way that we still talk endlessly about Jack the Ripper and the Kennedy assassination, and not that that's actually a mystery, and all these sorts of unsolved cases that are still fascinating to people.
Well, it'd be that, but it would be with a tinge of the Mary Celeste as well, wouldn't it? You know,
Mary Celeste, exactly. That's another one. This would be talked about and debated. You'd have you'd have a cottage industry of books of people, purporting to solve this. In the same way that, as I say, there's a massive publishing industry around the Jack the Ripper murders. There'd be endless TV documentaries. There'd be endless books about it. There'd be like conferences. People would be buffs of the case. There'd be so many podcasts about it, true crime podcasts about it. And I think, in exactly the same way that in the Jack the Ripper murders, you get all these letters to the cops and letters to the newspaper editors purporting to be from Jack the Ripper, all of which, as far as I can tell, are completely fake. You'd get loads of false confessions. Exactly. Somebody would, for instance, come up with their theory about what happened, write it down as Wargrave, put it in a bottle, or claim that they'd found it in a bottle in the sea. And try to publish that. Because, as I say, the account that supposedly explains what happened at the end, it doesn't satisfy. It doesn't make any sense on so many levels. It completely fails to explain satisfactorily what happens in the book. The information we are privy to about what happens is not explained by that final confession. So I read that final confession as a fake. Basically, it's somebody's theory that they have decided to pretend is Wargrave's confession and pretend that they found in a bottle. And that make there's a We've talked a little bit about the novel The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. There's a really interesting book by the French literary critic Pierre Bayard called Who Killed Roger Ackroyd? And what he does in that is, it's a really interesting book because it goes into Agatha Christie's techniques, because she's a really, again, one of the things people don't realize about her is that she's a relentless formal experimenter. She plays around with the literary form of the detective novel endlessly, and she tries every permutation. She does everybody did it, nobody did it turns out it wasn't even a murder, the policeman investigating did it, a child did it, etc., etc. And one in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we've danced around this before. I'm going to spoil it. Okay, spoilers. If you haven't read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd,
pause now.
Pause the podcast and fast forward a bit. I'm going to spoil it. What happens in that book is it's narrated in the first person by Dr. Shepard. At the end of the novel, Hercule Poirot decides that the murderer is Dr. Shepard, the narrator of the book. Now, of course, Dr. Shepard hasn't told us in the course of narrating the story that he did the murder. What he says is something like, he says as he's leaving Ackroyd's office after we are supposedly told that he's murdered him, he says something like, I did what had to be done, or I finished the necessary things, and then I closed the office door and went home. So again, it's Agatha Christie's clever use of literary form. Bring us into the mind and the interior monologue of the murderer, or the self-account of the murderer, and to tell us no lies, to have the murderer tell us the literal truth, but through omission to leave the fact that he's done the murder completely obscure in the text. And again, I was saying that she does things like this in And Then There Were None as well. You get a section where you get an account of the interior monologue of the characters, and one of them is, of course, the murderer's interior monologue. But of course, she's not telling you who the individual thoughts belong to, things like that. And in this book, Pierre Bayard theorizes. He goes through an analysis of her way of doing this. And then he theorizes that Dr. Shepard is not actually the murderer. What happened is Poirot got the wrong person. And the murderer is actually Shepard's sister, Caroline Shepard. And Shepard has accepted the responsibility for the murder after Poirot mistakenly identified him as the killer in order to protect his sister. And that is not only completely compatible with the text as it stands, because it's written precisely in that formally clever way which omits information. It's not only completely, in literal terms, it's completely compatible with the text as it stands, but it makes more sense. His explanation of the murder makes a lot more sense than the theory that Poirot comes up with. And I feel like you could probably do that with a lot of Agatha Christie's novels, actually. And I feel like you could definitely do that with And Then There Were None. Or rather, the really interesting thing about And Then There Were None is that I don't think there is any possible solution to this that really makes sense. So what you are left with, again, kind of accidentally or behind its own back or unconsciously, you are left with something that, despite the author's intentions, is an uncanny tale, is a supernatural tale, is an unsolvable mystery, is a story that just cannot be solved. And that's really interesting. It's like the book itself tries to solve itself rationally and materially.
Yeah.
And it can only do that by bringing in a fake confession and asking us to believe that confession. Whereas what we actually have is a story that just completely defies explanation.
It's like almost she was reaching for a iconic mystery novel, and obviously hit the bullseye in one respect, but also she somehow reached into a parallel universe and actually plucked out a real unsolved murder case, like you were saying, from some other universe where that is real.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, I'll press pause, I'll delete this whole podcast, and instead we can reconvene and record a podcast set in the universe where that did really happen. And we can be those podcasters who are just analysing it, and coming up with our own theories and things like that,
I would love to do something like that, like a complete fake true crime podcast about this as if it was a real case.
Yeah.
That'd be fantastic.
Brilliant. Well, I said I had two questions for you. I am aware that we're close to wrapping up, and this could be another hour, so let's try to make it succinct. But I
talk too much. I know. I'm sorry.
Me too. I was intrigued by you talking about, the characters. You could read the characters being haunted by we, the reader, but by the presence of eyes upon them in that sense. Of the adaptations, and I guess particularly the adaptations that you like, the most, or, your favourite adaptation, should we say, to concentrate it down. Do you think there's elements, because obviously with a film you could kind of get into that claustrophobia a bit more visually, and in terms of the gaze, in this case of the viewer. Do you think there's any adaptations that you admire of this? Firstly, what's your favourite adaptation of this? Because we sort of skirted that a bit before. And do you think it's partly your favourite because it starts to play around with things like that? It sort of makes interesting visually what is the mood of this book,
Well, the adaptations are really interesting. My favourite is the original 1945 one, the black and white one. The Soviet one is a bit of an outlier just by virtue of the fact that it's an interesting film. It's good. It has some interesting surreal imagery in it towards the end, but it is very much an outlier. The 70s one, as I say, I desperately want to like it because it's the 70s one and it's got Oliver Reed in it and Richard Attenborough. I really want to like it, but it's just so badly made. And as I say, the music is intolerable. So the ones that I like the best are, as I say, the original one from 45 and the modern one, the one from 2017, 2018, whatever it is, the TV one, that is in 3 parts, so it's 3 hours long. And it's incredibly portentous and grim dark, and it's working incredibly hard at being sinister. And it's adapted so that it kind of removes all the subtlety. It puts in things like the young woman that Emily Brent employed. It puts in a flashback where you see Emily Brent sort of being a predatory lesbian and trying to sexually abuse her. And Lombard leaving native tribesmen to die becomes, you get a shot of him and several guys striding away from what are obviously killing fields covered in blood and carrying machetes. So it's become not murder by abandonment, but actual sort of mass slaughter, and does loads of things like that. MacArthur doesn't send the young officer off on a suicide mission. He just shoots him dead in the trenches, things like that. So it completely removes all the subtlety. But the interesting thing about that is that it also kind of takes the benefit of the doubt away from these people. It kind of just says, these people, they have their versions of what happened, but actually they're just fucking murderers.
Yeah.
They're just, it becomes quite savage at times. You see a flashback to the Blore thing, and it's not he frames a guy who goes to prison and he dies in prison. It's actually he comes onto him, and then to cover up the fact that he's come onto him and been rebuffed, he kicks him to death. Things like that. So there is something about the intense savagery of the modern one that is kind of refreshing. It kind of removes all the alibis, all the excuses, even as it removes the subtlety, it also removes all the weaseling.
Yeah.
You know. But the interesting thing about those two is that they're at completely the opposite ends of the spectrum, not only in time but in affect. Because, as I say, the 2017 one, it's incredibly self-serious and portentous and dark and grim and sinister, and tries to be psychologically realistic and things like this. But it's kind of funny. It's just by virtue of all that.
Yeah.
It's just kind of ridiculous. Because it's so turned up to 11. Everything is so turned up to 11, and it's so po-faced. You just laugh at it. Whereas the 45 one, the old one, it's couched as a comedy. Its tone is as a comedy. It makes Vera completely innocent, and it makes Lombard into not really Philip Lombard. It makes him somebody else using that name. So you have the morally unimpeachable young couple in love at the center of it who survive and get away at the end.
Yeah.
And all the characters become funny to one degree or another. They all become sort of comedy grotesques, and the murders are really, really toned down. You don't see anything gory or anything like that. And yet, the disjunction between the tone that it takes, the comedic tone, and what is actually supposed to be happening on screen, creates this incredible feeling of unease. The film is constantly playing against itself. It's saying to you out of one side of its mouth, "Isn't this funny? Look at these funny characters. Ha ha." And out of the other side of its mouth, it's saying, "Yeah, they're all being murdered. Here's a gruesome murder. Here's another gruesome murder." And I think it's incredibly interesting that that's made in 45. It's made as the Second World War is ending. So it ties in with that theme, as I say, about the island as a microcosm of British society constantly in a state of war. And it shows you that at the end of the Second World War, you know, these years of unimaginable carnage, and the affect that it's going for is, let's have a laugh. You know, we're out the other side of this, or we're nearly out the other side of this. Nobody wants to watch anything depressing or think about anything depressing. Let's make this light and funny. But as I say, it's still the story about the island where there's just general annihilation, mass murder. It's still that story. So there's this incredible feeling of cognitive dissonance about it, where it's telling it, you know, at that moment in history, it's presenting you with a story of Britain as a site of mass slaughter, and it's trying to laugh about it. And it creates this incredibly unsettling affect, which is far more effective than the modern po-faced one.
No, that's fascinating. It also sounds like it's sort of prefiguring the Lady Killers a little bit as well. You know, like that kind of
absolutely,
that kind of dark comedy mood. You know, I'll ask you for final thoughts in a sec, Jack. But I had one of my own that I wanted to get to, because there's the scene roughly halfway through the book, I think, where I think it's Lombard and Vera Claythorne having a sort of slightly flirtatious energy conversation about their theories about who at that stage who done it. You know, who the killer is. And I realised it was reminding me of something, and you know, obviously it could remind you of any number of scenes where people theorise about this sort of thing. I realised what it was reminding me of was the scene in Scream 2, where is it David Arquette and I can't remember what the actor's name is, but the film nerd character in Scream, where they have a conversation in like a cafe where they're doing exactly the same thing, you know, kind of like running through the options for the viewer. You know, they're like very aware that they're in a film, you know, like in a film like Scream, where, you know, you'll be thinking all these thoughts, and that must recur in so much detective fiction, where, you know, you have two characters basically spell out these thoughts. But I realised that what I was getting from was Scream 2, and it just reinforced again, you know, how much Scream and the Scream series is you know, a modern whodunit with all those tropes recurring in it. So I just wanted to mention that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I haven't actually seen Scream 2. I've only seen the original Scream, which I like very much. I like that movie, but I've never actually gotten around to seeing any of the others. But yeah, I think linking this to that is a good shout, because another thing that people that haven't read much Agatha Christie don't get is that she is very metafictional. She is very aware of the genre she's working in and the tropes of the genre she's working in, and she can be almost fourth wall breaky, so to speak, at times. A lot of the books are concerned with people kind of being aware of, a lot of them have, and this book has them saying to each other, this doesn't seem like something real. This is like something from a book. This is like something from a detective story. That happens in a lot of her books. And as I say, she's a formal experimenter. And a lot of what she does is, she's, as I say, she's very conscious of the genre and the tropes of the genre and the mechanics of the genre. And she's, whatever else you want to say about her, she's a virtuoso at using them and manipulating them. She tries all these different variations on the form. And there's a very heightened formal awareness that just comes from her intense cleverness at doing that, of manipulating the mechanics of the genre. And it makes me think about, really, when you get to the end, that last epilogue, which is supposedly Wargrave's confession, really we were saying it's like a fake confession that somebody's appended. Well, who is that somebody? Who is the person that created the fake confession and stuck it at the end in an attempt? Well, it's Agatha Christie. She's the one that's faked a confession, so to speak. As I say, I don't find the confession convincing. I don't find it satisfactory. It doesn't fit the book, which, in sort of formal terms makes the book a failure. But actually, in its actual effect, it makes the book more interesting. So if you read the final confession that way, and it's somebody's fake confession, their attempt to, bend and twist the facts so that they fit their pet theory about what happened, the only person that can really be is the writer, is Agatha Christie herself, pretending to be Wargrave, so to speak, And that really does fit in with what Wargrave says, because Wargrave actually talks about, all my life I've had this romantic nature, and I've been fascinated with murder, but I also have a strong sense of justice, and I've spent so much time devising different ways of committing murder. Well, that's Agatha Christie talking about herself.
So that's Agatha Christie as Bugs Bunny and Duck Amuck, basically, just like kind of rewriting and repainting the universe. And that's a funny mirror to her reported method as well. I think people simplify it a bit, but her thing of working out how the book ended, and then going back and rewriting it so it worked. That's kind of this is her as murderous rewriter.
Yeah, I'm sure there is some truth to that. She actually said that this was the book that she did the most planning for. She had the idea for this, and she identified it as the book where she did the most structural planning. So that's an interesting, because it is in terms of its structure, in terms of how the different events that are described fit together, it's an incredibly complex and complicated book. You have to admire the way she keeps all the moving parts, fitting together, which only makes it more disorientating when you get to the end, as I say, and the final cogwheel doesn't actually slot into place at all. But as I say, I just find that makes the book more interesting. It makes it more uncanny and more open.
Well, this is her design.
Yeah.
Well, Jack, it's been fascinating talking to you about that book. Thank you for encouraging me to read it. Thank you for coming on the show again. I really appreciate getting a chance to chat to you about a few things in the prelude there and the book. And it was just really interesting. I really enjoyed the experience. Would you like to plug what you've been up to and where people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Yes, plug my stuff. You can find me on Twitter @_Jack_Graham_. You'll find pretty much links to pretty much everything I do on there. I occasionally podcast for Eruditorum Press, and you can find all my podcasts on the Pex Lives podcast stream. I occasionally write things which go up at Eruditorum Press, and then after a little while, they go up at my Substack, Times Carcass. You'll get advance access to pretty much everything I do on my Patreon, which you can have full access to for as little as $1 a month. I have various projects in the air. At the moment, I am doing a series with my wonderful friends George Daniel Lee and Elliot Chapman called Hannibal Digested, where we are going through the entire Hannibal TV series. At the moment, 2 episodes at a time, and talking about that. We have 2 episodes of that out already, a sort of introductory episode and the first episode where we talk about episodes 1 and 2 of series 1 of Hannibal. That's going to be continuing, and you'll get advance access to those on my Patreon, and then they go up at George's YouTube channel, Exaggerated Elegy. I also have a running series of completely exclusive Patreon podcasts. Well, Kit has them on his Patreon as well, but only patrons of myself or Kit get them, called the Backer Street Irregulars, where my dear friends Kit and Daniel Harper talk about the entire Sherlock Holmes canon, every story in the Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes canon. And we've just finished doing the first collection, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and we're sort of in the middle of doing a wrap-up on that, and then we'll get started on the next collection. So if you want to listen to those, as I say, my Patreon is the place to go, $1 a month. Also on my Patreon, you get advance access to bonus episodes of I Don't Speak German, which I do with Daniel Harper, which is my main project. I Don't Speak German is a podcast. As I say, it's at Libsyn. We're on all the podcast platforms. I've also put it on YouTube now, where my friend Daniel Harper and I talk about today's fascists and Nazis and far-right extremists and the entire reactionary sphere around these people. We've done all sorts of episodes. We've done episodes on James Lindsay. We've done episodes on Brett and Heather and Eric Weinstein. We've done Tim Pool, as well as more niche, lesser-known people in the far right. And it's pretty heavy. It's pretty depressing, but it's also, I mean, Daniel and I try to make it a little bit accessible and a little bit fun, as much as it can be. So, yeah, I think that's everything at the moment. So I think that might be enough. I think that might be enough to be going on with.
Yeah, I think that was there's a lot in there, and all very heavily recommended. And I can confirm that I Don't Speak German is more fun than it sounds, which it was always good to emphasise, isn't it? As well as containing some heavy material. I'll put links in the show notes below to that stuff there, so you can find it. Well, that's all from me. Thanks for joining us, Jack. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for listening to my very strange obsessions.
And goodbye from me. See you next time. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.